I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 12 o'clock on Monday, the 4th of March.
Extremism could be redefined for the first time in a decade as part of a wider crackdown on those who seek to undermine our democracy.
This comes as George Galloway is to be sworn into Parliament this afternoon, introduced by his old friend Jeremy Corbyn. Will he be shunned or find other allies in the Commons?
And Labour comes under fire as a shadow minister says young people will have no option for a life on benefits if they win the election. Is a tougher stance on welfare, though, a vote winner?
Reparations. The Church of England has been told that its proposed £100 million in investments is not enough to atone for its historical links in the slave trade, and that they should instead invest 10 times as much, £1 billion.
Gosh. There's one chipper man today, isn't there?
There
Mr.
is,
George
there is.
Galloway.
He's already been spotted swanning into Parliament and saying that he actually quite likes the place, at least the buildings, not the people.
Yes, he says he's feeling good. That's what George Galloway has to say. It'll be very interesting, though, to see what the reaction is in the room, in the building, in the Commons, to see if people aren't too happy to see him there.
Well, precisely. It's been quite a while, almost 9 years since he was last a Member of Parliament, but he will be being introduced during our airtime. We will show you him walking in to the House of Commons, flanked on one side by Sir Peter Bottomley, the father of the House, and on the other side, Jeremy Corbyn.
Now, not everyone. There were other people asked, weren't there? Other politicians asked to accompany him.
Initially, David Davis was going to be the man walking to his left, taking him in, but he's backed out of that commitment and left it to the father of the House.
Yes, so let us know. Do you think he'll be shunned entirely, or do you think, actually, he might find a few allies in the House of Commons that agree with him on quite a few things? Let us know what you think. gbviews@gbnews.com. There are also a few things that we need to look out for, aren't there? A few tricks.
Well, number one, if you are going to swear or affirm, now, if you swear by Almighty God, that's the sort of religious way of swearing in to be an MP, but you can affirm, and that's the sort of irreligious way. The other thing, of course, is you have to swear an oath of loyalty to the King. Now, some members of Parliament who are Republicans, well, they still have to say the oath, but they cross their fingers.
They do this behind their back.
As they say it, behind their back.
Well, maybe
some
George...
SNP MPs who do that, some socialist MPs do that. Maybe George Galloway will, maybe he won't.
Well, there you go. Let us know your views, gbviews@gbnews.com. But let's get your headlines.
Emily, thank you. Your top stories this afternoon. The Chancellor says he wants to move the UK to a lower taxed economy, but in a responsible way. Income tax has reached an historic high, and while promising some cuts, Jeremy Hunt has been trying to temper expectations ahead of Wednesday's budget. Jeremy Hunt insists the government isn't looking to borrow more money and is focusing on boosting the economy.
We do want to move to a lower taxed economy, but we're only going to do so in a way that is responsible and recognises that there are things that taxes pay for, that we couldn't cut taxes by borrowing. We'll do so in a responsible way, but if we can spend money on public services more efficiently, then that will mean less pressure on taxpayers.
Speaking to GB News, former Home Secretary Dame Priti Patel says the government needs to be more cautious when it comes to spending.
We have over 500,000 civil servants. Now, even to shave a degree off that would cut public expenditure by at least £1 billion, and that would be great. Back again in 2010, 2016, we had under, I think, around 400,000 civil servants, and that saved a significant amount of money. The spending, the costs alone, I think, came down to something like £11 billion. This is where we have to be again, to be an agile government that's fit in the sense of financially sound money, conservative principles, but actually making sure the public keep more of their money.
George Galloway is due to be sworn in as the new Rochdale MP later today. Arriving at the Commons this morning, he was asked how he feels about his comeback.
Well, I'll tell you what's happening inside. I always loved the building. The people in it, not quite so much.
The Workers' Party of Britain leader won last week's by-election by more than 5,500 votes. The focus of his campaign was the ongoing war in Gaza, warning Sir Keir Starmer that Labour would pay a high price for enabling what he says is a catastrophe. Mr Galloway was a Labour MP for 16 years. He was suspended from the party in 2003 over remarks made at the start of the Iraq War. The government's Rwanda bill returns to the House of Lords this afternoon as the legislation enters its final stages in Parliament. Nearly 50 amendments have been tabled, with a number of votes expected today and on Wednesday. Among them, the government's assessment that Rwanda is a safe country for asylum seekers. It comes almost 2 years after ministers first announced the plan to send some migrants to the East African country. The government has promised that the first flights will happen in the spring. Meanwhile, GB News understands around 270 migrants have been intercepted crossing the Channel in 5 small boats today. That's after 327 made the crossing yesterday. The same day, a 7-year-old girl died after a boat capsized. She'd been travelling with her pregnant mother, her father and 3 siblings when the boat got into difficulty in the early hours of yesterday morning. Education leaders are calling for a double-digit pay rise for all teachers across England. It's after the government said school salaries should return to a more reasonable level. The National Association of Head Teachers Unions says England currently has the highest number of unfilled teaching posts in over a decade. It says a raise of at least 10% will counter the recruitment crisis. Nikki Haley has defeated Donald Trump in the Republican primary in Washington, D.C. This is her first victory over the former president in this year's campaign to become the Republican presidential candidate. She lost in her home state of South Carolina, but she's now the first woman to win a Republican primary in US history. The only remaining challenger to Donald Trump in the race, she won almost 63% of the vote. However, Mr. Trump has a significant lead over Ms. Haley and is likely to face Joe Biden in the election later this year. And a Ferrari stolen from a former Formula One driver 28 years ago has been recovered by police. The sports car, stolen from Austrian driver Gerhard Berger, is worth around £350,000. The Ferrari F512M was one of two vehicles taken while their drivers were at the San Marino Grand Prix in 1995. The Met Police says officers received a report from the car maker in January after the company carried out checks on a vehicle being brought by a US buyer through a UK broker last year. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Tom and Emily.
How safe are we in Britain? The government is reportedly seeking to expand the definition of extremism for the first time in a decade to include those who seek to undermine British values and institutions.
That would mean groups who use intimidation or violence could be excluded from taxpayer funding.
Well, since Hamas attacked Israel on the 7th of October, MPs have experienced an increased level of intimidation and hate. And speaking on GB News earlier, the former Home Secretary, Priti Patel, warned this is curtailing the work of MPs.
I'm very conscientious. There are things that I do, you know, around my own personal safety and security. I had 3 attempted assaults on me last year after I left being Home Secretary. And all of it was, you know, totally unprovoked by me, just people feeling that they had the licence to come up and be physically and verbally intimidating and threatening. That is just not acceptable. I'm afraid this is the reality of the country that we live in. I want our democracy to be free-flowing and, you know, I want us to be able to go around doing what we do. But I can say now, people do not speak as freely in Parliament as they do and would have previously on issues because they are worried. And they're not just worried for themselves, they're worried about their families.
Well, that was Priti Patel this morning. But joining us now is the Conservative MP for Peterborough, Paul Bristow. Paul, interesting to hear from Priti Patel. Particularly stuck out to me is what she said about how some of our MPs don't speak as freely as they would like in the Houses of Parliament because of the threat of intimidation and or violence.
Hello, Emily. I can only really speak for myself. I will always say what I believe in, free from intimidation and free from threats, etc. I always speak passionately about what I believe in. I don't feel necessarily less safe than I did a week, a month, 6 months ago. I have had threats against my personal safety and that of my family, but it's the usual loudmouth fools on social media who probably wouldn't say boo to a goose if I kind of looked at them in the face. But look, I'm speaking on behalf of myself here. I think women get it a lot worse than men. And I guess the difference between me and perhaps other MPs, and I'm not speaking on their behalf, is this is my city. This is where I live, and I certainly don't expect security when I go to the supermarket or I go to a restaurant or I take my kids to the park. And that's the way I've always engaged myself and always.
Paul, you have previously spoken about online abuse, haven't you? Particularly after the vote on Gaza, you said you've received quite a lot of abuse after calling for a ceasefire.
Well, I did. I mean, the abuse actually came not necessarily after anything I did. It's the way, I suppose, my political opponents, opposition councillors, etc., have misinterpreted what I did. But as I say, it was the loudmouth sort of people on social media. I've never been intimidated face-to-face or physically. But look, it's not right. And what does worry me, actually, is the way other potential people may be put off going into politics as a result of it. But speaking personally, and not everyone's, we don't want everyone to be exactly the same and everyone, like me, etc., etc. But just speaking personally, it's water off a duck's back, really.
Paul, looking at policy, and the policy that is flowing from the Prime Minister's wide-ranging speech on Friday, we now learn that the definition of extremism is being sought to be changed by the government to include what some might view as the quite nebulous concept of those who seek to undermine democracy. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think we have to pay attention to the security services, and they're saying that we are now less safe than we've been for a significant period of time in terms of some sort of attack or some sort of incident. And I think we have to take that very seriously. But these things always have to be reviewed and examined from time to time. And I think that's right. You know, there's no point keeping doing the same thing that we've been doing on. And if there's good reasons to change the way we describe extremism, I think that's got to be welcomed.
I imagine there will be, and I'm sure there already has been, quite a lot of pushback about any notion of expanding that definition, because it could encompass people who just oppose government policy. That would be the worry, that it might actually diminish debate and free expression.
I think there's a world of difference between people who disagree with government policy or disagree with a Labour Party policy or an opposition policy, and those who wish to disrupt our democratic values. I mean, people who sit in the middle of the street, like Just Stop Oil, trying to stop us going around our daily business, blocking ambulances, blocking people trying to get their kids to school, blocking people trying to get to hospital. I think that's pretty extreme, don't you?
Certainly, it does seem, though, that this goes much beyond that and potentially could be wielded in other settings. And I do wonder if laying the groundwork for defining extremism as anything that seeks to undermine democracy, could any future government say that campaigning against government policies in some areas could fit in that definition?
Well, this is Britain, Tom. This is not a country with a strong track record of that sort of repressive government way. So I would be less worried about that. I think this is probably trying to capture those sorts of people who do the sorts of things that I just described, who would sit in the middle of the road, disrupt sporting events, prevent people going to hospital, throwing paint over priceless pieces of artwork. The nature of political protest, the nature of how people are opposing various different things have changed. And I think it's quite right that the law changes and the way we define things changes to keep up with these modern, not threats, but these modern ways of disrupting everyday life.
Now, there'll be another change in Parliament today, of course. A new colleague of yours joining the Green benches, albeit the benches opposite where you sit. What are you expecting to see when you get to Parliament a bit later today and see George Galloway introduced?
Well, let's remember, George Galloway won that election. And I think it is a demonstration, actually, of parts of the Midlands and parts of the North rejecting perhaps the two major parties, what they see as change in the way Brexit did. And if they do kind of vote for parties which want to upset the apple cart, it's not surprising sometimes, no matter how ugly that may seem occasionally. George Galloway did win that election, and he deserves to be in Parliament as much as anyone else. I think it's hugely regrettable. I wish a Conservative had won. But my challenge to the two main parties, especially my party, is we've got to learn again how to talk to those people who in 2019
it wasn't just a rejection of the Labour Party and the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. It was because he fought his campaign on the issue of Gaza.
Well, I think obviously that was a huge part of it, but I think we'll be wrong to think two things. First off, there's a lot of nonsense talked about that if Labour hadn't had their problems and their candidate was properly endorsed, that they'd have won that election. I think that's nonsense. I think Galloway would still have won that election. And I think secondly, he attracted a significant number of votes, I would imagine, from white working class communities as well. It wouldn't have just been the Muslim community that voted for him. And a lot of it, I think, was a rejection of the status quo.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for your time, Paul. Paul Bristow there, MP for Peterborough. Great to speak to you. Good stuff.
No, really interesting. Speaking of George Galloway, of course, he returned as an MP. He'll be sworn in as an MP today. Last week, he won that hugely controversial by-election in Rochdale. And, of course, that swearing in we're expecting during this programme.
We are indeed. Well, joining us now is our political correspondent, Catherine Forster, with the details for us. Catherine, where are you and what can we expect this afternoon?
Yes, well, I'm currently in Wiltshire, where the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has been announcing money. But back in Westminster, a very big moment for George Galloway, because here he comes again, going to be taking up his seat in Parliament again, as he did originally way back in 1987 for Labour and then for other parties as well. But so originally we thought it was Tory MP David Davis was going to be accompanying him in. David Davis apparently declined that privilege. We expect him to be accompanied in by Jeremy Corbyn and the father of the House, Peter Bottomley. He will have to take either an oath or an affirmation. He can choose. The oath involves holding the Bible or another religious text they can choose, and lots of references to God, or he can swear, as I think possibly more likely, a more simple affirmation. Still have to pledge allegiance to the king, however, and then he can take his seat on the green benches. It'll be interesting to see who is keen or not keen to sit next to him. I think many people will not be keen to sit next to him, but you know, he won that election in Rochdale. He got almost double the number of votes of the person who came in second, who was the local chap, David Tully, saying he just wanted to do the best for his community. But of course, George Galloway said, "This is for Gaza." Those were the first words he said on winning the seat. And also, he said that he was doing this basically to trouble Labour, which it no doubt will. I was at both the count and then at the rally held in this second-hand car dealers in Rochdale, surrounded, I have to say, most of his supporters were definitely Muslim. I was also struck by the cars because George Galloway is a socialist man of the people, yet he was driven away in a very smart black Range Rover, the sort of thing that the Prime Minister gets taken around in, and some of his supporters were sitting there revving their engine in a very bright blue Lamborghini. It was quite something, but my goodness, he has a way with words. You can't dispute that, and not only is he making trouble for Labour, but I think for the whole political establishment, because he's got no love for Sir Keir Starmer, but of course he also said at the weekend, "I despise the Prime Minister." So at a time when people are calling for more civil discourse and worried about threats to MPs, George Galloway, I think, is only going to raise the temperature further.
Of course, George Galloway is a large figure, not just in this country, but increasingly around the world. Catherine, I want to read to you a note that was published online by the Houthis in the last day or so, saying that in order to release what they say is a UK-owned cargo ship, you have the chance to salvage this ship by sending a letter of guarantee signed by George Galloway that relief trucks agreed upon at that time would enter Gaza. It seems that George Galloway is now being thrown around as an element of international diplomacy.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's quite astonishing, isn't it? Because, of course, we've been involved in military action along with the United States, targeting the Houthi rebels who've been bombing ships going through the Red Sea. And certainly, I mean, George Galloway has for decades supported Palestinians, supported their cause. I'm not sure that I subscribe to the theory that he's really got any serious influence. Let's face it, nothing that happens in British Parliament, really, the votes we had last week or whatever, a couple of weeks ago, is going to influence Benjamin Netanyahu. That is something for the United States, for Qatar, for other countries. I'd be sceptical of George Galloway's influential though he is.
Yes, it seems that Mohammed Ali al-Houthi might have just been stirring the pot, perhaps trying to make some mischief.
It does suggest that there may be some interesting people lobbying George Galloway in the House of Commons. But thank you very much indeed, Catherine Forster there in Wiltshire, our political correspondent. Yes, not a great look, eh?
No, not a great look. But I do think that it does seem that the Houthis or whoever else are trying to sort of undermine or just get under the skin of the Prime Minister, trying to sort of sow division in the UK and referring to what was a pretty extraordinary and unusual by-election as if somehow George Galloway is now a representative of the UK. Of course, he's not. He's
I do think
representative within the UK.
I do think Paul Bristow there, who we spoke to, the Conservative MP, is all very blasé and relaxed about everything. I do sometimes wonder, what does he actually think about everything? Yes.
I think he's
you get a
just quite
strong
a
view,
relaxed
just
guy.
very relaxed about everything. Oh, you know, this and that. Well, OK. Well, there are clearly major issues. Your Prime Minister certainly thinks there are. Well, still to come, in a countdown to Wednesday's hotly anticipated budget, we're looking at whether the Chancellor will put more pounds in your pocket. Fingers crossed. This is Good Afternoon Britain on GB News with Britain's election channel.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight. Every night from 11 p.m.
Mail on Sunday, and the University of Buckingham is calling out wokery at the University of Cambridge. So I guess the culture wars must be almost over then, Josh.
Almost, yeah. Cambridge University discriminating against rich, white, privileged, privately educated men, claims...
The worst
which
kind.
Is, yeah, basically me. Claims Vice-Chancellor of rival institution, which is launching a degree course on the rise of woke culture. Now, I 100% agree with this. I applied to get into Cambridge, and I didn't get in because I was too thick.
Oh, wow, so it wasn't the DEI mafia?
No, unfortunately, it was pre-DEI. So it's like a double insult now.
Were you one of those guys who was like had a B average? You know, you look like you should be an A because you act like an A.
I act like an A.
You act
I've
like
got
an
glasses.
A. Yeah.
They're fake. I don't even have to. They don't even have lenses in them.
Lewis, do you think that this is a little bit cynical? Because I looked up this University of Buckingham, and they opened in 1973, and their tagline on the internet is "the home of the two-year degree." They're trying to bring down Cambridge University with this.
Well, why not pick the biggest? I mean, that's why we should. We should be attacking the BBC 24/7 on this thing.
I thought we were.
We aren't. We don't mention it enough.
Listen.
What I found shocking about this story is Buckingham is the country's oldest private university, and was founded in 1976. Something is wrong there. What do you think? Was Oxford founded by the government? I don't think it was. Was Cambridge?
No, absolutely not. I looked up Cambridge was 1209.
Yes, exactly.
So you can
it
get...
wasn't a government
But this is
grant.
actually quite scary. They can do a course on the origins of the woke movement. I'm just saying, someone's going to have a degree, and our job is going to be under threat. They're going to know much more than us.
Never.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 25 minutes past 12, and the Chancellor has delivered his much-anticipated, or will deliver his much... Goodness me, I was getting ahead of myself there, wasn't I?
No, our budget show is on Wednesday, Tom,
No,
and it's going to be an absolute cracker, and it's going to be from Westminster, actually, so, you know, put that in the diary. Anyway.
Indeed. Well, Jeremy Hunt will be delivering that budget on Wednesday, but today he's been hinting at tax cuts while visiting a factory in Wiltshire.
We do want to move to a lower taxed economy, but we're only going to do so in a way that is responsible and recognises that there are things that taxes pay for, that we couldn't cut taxes by borrowing. We'll do so in a responsible way, but if we can spend money on public services more efficiently, then that will mean less pressure on taxpayers.
Well, joining us now is our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, with On the Money. Liam, now, from what I've been hearing in the press anyway, these tax cuts are rather illusionary. It will be that perhaps we might get a tax cut somewhere, but then they'll pile on the taxes elsewhere. Is that right?
I think that's roughly right. I must say, Tom, I'd be worried there for a moment. I thought I was missing something. A budget's going on, and I'm not even covering.
I know.
Let's have a little on the money graphic, and we can just go through these various points. Safe to say, Tom, that the first line of my on the money graphic is that the statement is on Wednesday, the 6th of March. So recalibrate your diary, young man. But you're right, Emily. Jeremy Hunt is hinting, and indeed he just hinted there to our colleague Catherine Forster, he may cut 1 or 2p off the main 20% rate of income tax, but he could cut the national insurance rate instead. And I'll explain in a moment the difference between the two and why he might opt for one rather than the other. To pay for these tax cuts, he is going to basically try and raid the rich by raising airfares for business class passengers on airlines, and also potentially ending or certainly making less generous the non-dom tax status, which allows foreign-born people resident in the UK but not strictly domiciled here in the UK, whatever that means, talk to a tax accountant, to force them to pay more tax. That non-dom very kind tax regime, which attracts lots of wealthy people to the UK, particularly to the capital here in London, has been made slightly less generous in recent years, but it's definitely Labour's firing line, and now it's in the Tories' firing line too.
It's very interesting, Liam, to see what the Labour Party is saying at the moment. To some people, given the rumours of the Tories adopting Labour Party policy, the Labour Party saying it's going to stick to Tory spending rules, what's the difference between these parties?
There's very little difference between the parties because, Tom, as you and Emily know well, times is tough, as a former Prime Minister may say. There isn't that much money in the public coffers because we're not growing. The UK was in recession at the back end of last year, with the economy actually shrinking, and the trend rate of growth pretty much since the financial crisis back in 2009 has collapsed from around 2.5% a year down to less than 1% a year. It's very hard to raise money from an economy when it's not growing. It makes politics more combative, more punchy, if you like, because the pie is smaller, so the rows about the size of that pie and who gets what particular slice are much, much more loaded. Let me just briefly say why he may go for a national insurance cut rather than an income tax cut. The reason is that pensioners pay income tax on their pensions, but they don't pay national insurance. So if you cut national insurance, it costs the Exchequer less in the short run than if you cut the income tax. But you can still say, look, this is a cut in the headline rate of tax. Indeed, they cut national insurance, the main rate, from 12 to 10% back in January, didn't they, having announced it in November? And they want to do a second tax cut now, and they want to do a third tax cut in an autumn statement before what is likely to be an autumn general election in October or November. The other thing about a national insurance cut rather than an income tax cut is that it applies across the whole of the UK. Scotland, of course, has a separate system of income tax with many more thresholds, much more complicated than in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. But an NIC cut, national insurance cut, applies right across the board, including in Scotland, where, of course, Sunak, he's held the spring conference there last week, didn't he? He's very keen to try and limit Labour's gains in Scotland. That's why another thing I think may happen, as well as the things I've highlighted, is that I think the Tories could start now to row back from this 75 pence in the pound windfall tax on profits of companies operating in the North Sea, drilling oil and gas. A lot of those companies are very small companies. They're not necessarily the big international oil and gas majors. They're small, often British-owned companies, often loaded with debt. And they've had their corporation tax rate, the tax on their profits, it's risen from 40% to 65%, now to 75% in the last 18 months or so. A lot of those firms are unfortunately going bust, or at the very least shelving their oil and gas projects at a time when we do need more oil and gas from the North Sea. Everyone pretty much acknowledges that, even the government's own Climate Change Commission. So that's another area where I think we could see some tax cuts.
That would be very
budget.
interesting. That would be very interesting indeed. Well, thank you very much, Liam Halligan, there, our economics and business editor, giving us a little taste of perhaps what's to come on Wednesday. We're going back on the windfall tax. Well, in my humble opinion, I did think it was a bit ludicrous to slap such a punitive windfall tax on oil and gas
75%.
at the time when we need oil and gas, and we need
the
it
most
in.
ridiculous thing is the Tories did this thinking that they'd get praise from across the board. The Labour Party still say, oh, you haven't done a proper windfall tax, as if 75% isn't high enough.
Yeah.
What do they want, 99%? 100%?
Well,
I mean, what?
A lot of them don't want there to be any oil and gas, right?
Oh,
so there you go.
tax would
on
do
the
that,
Just Stop Oil bandwagon. Now, later on in the show, we're going to be talking about this judge, actually. The judge who let them off with a bit of a slap on the wrist.
Without a prison sentence.
The women who were wearing paragliders on their backs at the pro-Palestinian protests. Apparently, he's going to be investigated, so we're going to get some legal opinion on that one, so stay tuned for that. But coming up, don't forget, you can join Nigel Farage and Michelle Dewberry for a budget special in Whitehaven.
Yes, scan the QR code on your screen and you could join them to take part on the show, or you could look it up online because the QR code... Oh, no, it's there. It's there in that corner. Yeah, great.
In my corner. Here it is.
There it is.
Here it is.
You've got it. You've got it.
Scan that, or gbnews.com, of course, and you can sign up for that Spring Budget Live. It is this Wednesday in Whitehaven. You won't want to miss it, actually. I think it's going to be a pretty good one. But should we get your latest headlines?
Emily, thank you. It's 12:33. These are your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Chancellor says he wants to move the UK to a lower-taxed economy, but will only do so in a responsible way. Jeremy Hunt made the comments while visiting a plant in Wiltshire, where he also announced a £360 million funding boost for manufacturing. Income tax has reached an historic high, and while promising some cuts, the Chancellor has been trying to temper expectations ahead of Wednesday's budget.
We do want to move to a lower taxed economy, but we're only going to do so in a way that is responsible and recognises that there are things that taxes pay for, that we couldn't cut taxes by borrowing. We'll do so in a responsible way, but if we can spend money on public services more efficiently, then that will mean less pressure on taxpayers.
George Galloway is due to be sworn in as the new Rochdale MP this afternoon. Arriving at the Commons this morning, he was asked how he feels about his comeback.
Well, I'll tell you once I've been inside. I always loved the building. The people in it, not quite so much.
The Workers' Party of Britain leader won last week's by-election by more than 5,500 votes. The focus of his campaign was the ongoing war in Gaza, warning Sir Keir Starmer that Labour would pay a high price for enabling what he says is a catastrophe. Mr Galloway was a Labour MP for 16 years. He was suspended from the party in 2003 over remarks made about the start of the Iraq War. And GB News understands around 270 migrants have been intercepted crossing the English Channel in 5 small boats today. That's after 327 made the crossing yesterday, the same day a 7-year-old girl died after a boat capsized. She'd been travelling with her pregnant mother, her father and 3 siblings when the boat got into difficulties in the early hours of yesterday morning. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Nana Queer, weekends from 3 p.m.
So after his mad dash to see his father last week, Prince Harry predictably went on TV to talk about it. He gave his first interview to Good Morning America, whilst apparently being filmed by a crew that were doing a documentary on the Invictus Games. He didn't disclose his father's diagnosis, but frankly, even the fact that he was on TV talking about it was concerning. No wonder they're keeping him at arm's length. This is what he said.
How did you get the news that the King was ill?
I spoke to him.
And what did you do next?
I jumped on a plane and went to go and see him as soon as I could.
How was that visit for you emotionally?
Look, I love my family. The fact that I was able to get on a plane and go and see him and spend any time with him, I'm grateful for that.
An illness in the family can have a galvanizing or sort of reunifying effect for a family.
Absolutely.
Is that possible in this case?
Yeah, I'm sure. Throughout all these families, I see it on a day-to-day basis. The strength of the family unit coming together.
He also said that he loves his family, but then he said that he had his own family in America. So which family does he love? The late Queen's last few years of life were marred with accusations of racism, which Harry later backtracked on, claiming that they hadn't actually used the word, so inadvertently admitting to gaslighting us all. But the Sussex's stock is falling in the States, and the only thing that makes them interesting is their proximity to the royal family. And now the King is ill, Harry has even offered to muck in and take on official duties to help his father. Look, I want to see reconciliation and love and joy, but I'm afraid Meghan has yet to even speak to her father as far as we know, and Harry didn't apparently even reach out to his brother. Whilst his dad might fall for it, I doubt William will be as soft. Good luck with that, Harry.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now, a rather curious story appeared in The Guardian moments before we came on air about the Church of England.
Yes, it had been understood that the Church of England was expected to pay £100 million in investments to repent for its involvement. To atone. Oh, very good. For its involvement in investments that were linked to the slave trade a couple of hundred years ago. Well, apparently that's not enough. £100 million, quite a large amount of money, you'd think, for an organisation that can't fix many church roofs up and down the country. No, not enough. Now the ask is for £1 billion to be invested in atonement.
Yes, so essentially what this £1 billion would go towards is investing globally in black-led businesses and providing grants. So those are a couple of the ways the money would be used. But £1 billion. Now, the Church of England commissioned this report itself. It got some independent researchers to do this for them and came up with this massive sum. And I'm thinking, speaking to people in local parishes, as you say, don't have enough money to fix their churches. Is this a priority for the Church of England? I mean, how many times has Justin Welby apologised for slavery links, for historical links to slavery? Many a time is the answer to that question.
And what help is it to just give money or to invest money in black-owned businesses? This isn't stuff that's linked to educational charities or anything. It's just investing in black-owned businesses, whether or not those black people happen to be involved in anything that was...
Well, there you go, Tom. You're thinking it through. You shouldn't think it through. You should just accept this. Anyway, let us know what you think, because we're going to be having a debate on this, essentially, whether the Church of England should pay slavery reparations. And in this time, it's an investment fund of up to £1 billion. That's what the ask is. Let us know what you think. gbviews@gbnews.com. A good use of the Church of England's time and money.
Well, moving on, there'll be no life on benefits. That's a message to young people from the Labour Party, which has set out its vision to boost youth employment.
Yes, the Shadow Works and Pension Secretary, Liz Kendall, says young people will be told they have a responsibility to accept jobs or training under a Labour government. In return, she unveiled a plan to offer them better mental health support and improved work and career advice.
She pointed out that 1 in 8 young people not in work, education or training was costing the taxpayer billions in benefits.
Yes, and she's come under a little bit of fire from the left of her party by suggesting that no young person should live a life on benefits. Not sure why that was controversial, but apparently, according to Twitter at least, that is a right-wing trope that young people are lazy or need to be on benefits, or that they want to live a life on benefits anyway.
Well, joining us now is Ed Davies, who is the who's the policy director of the Centre for Social Justice. Thank you for joining us. I suppose the big question here is why did Liz Kendall think that this was something that she should say? Is there a genuine problem here amongst young people and disengagement from work or employment or training?
Yeah, I think thanks for having me on. I think there is, and I'm glad that she's raised it, because there are hundreds of thousands of young people who are not in education, employment or training, and that has a lifelong scarring effect. So it's something we look at pretty closely. I think there's probably 3 areas that come back in our research quite a lot. The first one is employers actually saying that an awful lot of young people are simply not employment ready, and that's not really about skills or anything like that. It's the real basic stuff. Will they turn up at 9 o'clock each morning, look me in the eye, shake my hand, tuck their shirt in? Some of the basics like that aren't happening. I think the second one that comes back a bit is that we are probably over-promising what a career looks like. We have a huge number of graduates now, and sort of the promise is you get your degree and you go on a high-flying career, and actually, for most of us, it starts with a job. And it might not be a fulfilling, wonderful job, but a job hopefully leads to a better job, and a better job hopefully leads to a career, but it starts with a job. And then the last area that comes up a lot in our work at the moment is mental health problems. So you're more likely to be off sick in your 20s than your 40s now, and the real driver of that is mental health problems in young people, which are growing and becoming an increasing concern.
It's quite incredible to read those statistics about how people in their 20s are now more likely to be off for mental health, for poor mental health, than those in their 40s. Is it that mental health is completely out of control when it comes to young people, or is there something else going on? Are young people just not well equipped for working life to such an extent that it can give them anxiety or depression just to even face the workplace?
Yeah, I think there's probably 2 sides to this. I think there is a slight danger of over-medicalising life at the moment with young people, and we hear this quite a lot from small organisations they talk to, where children are anxious or stressed, and that is part of life, and it's being diagnosed as something more, and that's something we're looking at the moment, and that is a big concern. But the second part of this, which I think is a slightly bigger concern, is a lot of this rise in poor mental health is real. And the reasons for it are not straightforward, and they're quite difficult to come to grips with. And so before I worked at the Centre for Social Justice, I worked in the Department of Health, and we did a huge consultation on mental health. And it said the big factor in your mental health is your relationships, and specifically your family relationships. And when you look at what we have done to children's families over the last 40 years, you will see that, yes, if you are 40, 50, 60 now, you probably had a pretty stable family. If you are 10, 20, 30 now, you probably didn't. In fact, the numbers are quite staggering. So 50 years ago, as a 16-year-old, you almost certainly lived with both your parents. It was 90% chance. By just 10 years ago, so 40 years difference, it was almost 50-50. So you have this situation where we are eviscerating young people's lives and then expecting it not to matter, but it does. It matters very, very seriously. And if you'd asked any, policeman or teacher, they'd have said they are seeing this in their schools and their police cells over the last 20 years. And now we're seeing it in the economic inactivity statistics too.
Well, you have to be a brave politician to stand up and talk about the benefits of families staying together. Usually you see MPs being absolutely lambasted for suggesting that might be good for children's outcomes, but there you go.
Well, Ed Davies, thank you very much for joining us here. If in a sentence, if you would, we're running to a break.
So it's not just about staying together. We're not forming families in the first place, which is even more concerning.
Yes, that's probably the better point to make. Thank you very much indeed, Ed Davies, Policy Director of the Centre for Social Justice.
Now, don't forget to get your views in, gbviews@gbnews.com. We'll be getting to those in just a moment.
Yes, let us know about the slavery reparations. Should the Church of England pay £1 billion?
£1 billion.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Meanwhile, we've got Prince William getting on with being a real royal, or is he? I mean, this business about being ambassadorial in the Middle East, about the Gaza situation, about the Israeli situation, about trying to be friends with everyone, this is sensitive ground.
It's very demanding, I think. It must be one of the most difficult things he's ever done. He has been to Israel before and the Middle East. He was the first of the royals who went there, and he spoke to the leaders of both in Israel and on the West Bank.
Yeah.
And he managed it beautifully. He managed to carve a very sort of delicate path. I think as well, he doesn't want to cut ribbons. He doesn't want to do the ordinary things, to go round and see people and do it unless he really cares about it. This is people who are homeless. These are people who are in a war. I think he wants to go very, very high up, not for arrogance.
Make a difference in the world.
But to help, and to try and smooth things
Angela,
over.
I might be way off the mark here, but he did not, to me, look a happy man at BAFTAs on Sunday night. There was just
lonely, for sure.
Yeah, there was just something about his face that looked like I didn't want to be here.
It did. He did look lonely, but I also thought he made a huge effort so that everyone would enjoy it. He didn't want to pass it on. He doesn't use his personal feelings publicly, whereas Harry, you can tell a mile off what Harry's thinking. So he's done very well for that. And I think because he's been their president since 2010, he didn't want to let them down. Very nice of him. But he's obviously very worried about her. And he's got a lot of pressure there. I mean, he's a man with massive pressure for his father, for his wife, making sure the children are all right. And now he's taken on the Middle East, you know.
From 10 a.m. every Saturday, we want to make you think and we want to make you laugh.
So we will give you all the top stories.
Now we start with a story that has shocked the nation this week.
But we're also going to make it light and fun and bring some entertainment in to make your Saturday morning nice and restful.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Alarming new figures show that the police have failed to solve a single burglary in nearly half of all neighbourhoods in England and Wales over the past 3 years.
This is quite incredible. I can't believe it. The figures risk further undermining public confidence in the police. Is it even worth victims reporting crimes anymore?
Well, joining us now to find out why these cases are going unsolved is the former police detective Peter Blexley. Peter, when you heard these figures, did you think that, like I did, there's got to be some sort of mistake? There's got to be a misprint here. This can't really be the actual figure.
No, sadly, I didn't, because we're becoming increasingly aware in recent times just how much the police have turned their back on the moderate mainstream. The people that have their houses burgled, their cars stolen, their phones stolen, their bikes stolen, shopkeepers, and anybody who's a victim of fraud. Quite simply, in this day and age, you are unlikely to get an investigation of any kind. And therefore, it is a criminals charter that has been created, and we are all paying the price.
And it's not a small crime, is it? Burglary. We talk about lesser crimes when actually it can lead people to feel unsafe in their own homes. It can lead people to have to move because they can't get the police involved with this type of thing. They don't get any leads. The police don't look into any leads. it's not good for people.
It is a filthy, disgusting invasion of somebody's home, and often the repercussions are severe, and some people are simply never able to go back to that flat, that house, because they've been so traumatised what's happened to them. And for the police to come out with these mealy-mouthed words, which are very deceptive, that they did in 2022, when certain chiefs said police would attend every burglary, that's a deceit in itself, because there is a huge difference between attending a burglary and investigating a burglary. And now, sadly, in 2024, the standards of police training, recruitment, are so poor, together with ineffective supervision and inexperienced management, that these people, these officers that turn up at crimes, if indeed they do, don't know what they're looking for. They don't know where they might find tools or implements that have been discarded by a burglar. And the likelihood of getting any kind of forensic examination, I'm afraid, is extremely slim and probably non-existent.
Burglary, like so many other forms of theft or violent crime, seems to be done by a fairly small proportion of people who make up a very large proportion of the crimes. You'd think that going after certain gangs would actually be able to reduce the amount of burglary by more than you would think, if you see what I mean. Are the police just lacking in resources to do the sort of investigative, preventative work? Or what other reason could there be for the sort of lack of this sort of control?
The police are always claiming that they have a lack of resources, but it's getting towards this time in policing history now when a decision has to be made as to what kind of policing we're going to get and what are the police going to do. Are they going to be their current incarnation of a social service which hoovers up so much of their time, or do we want an effective, well-trained crime-fighting force? Because we're getting very much towards those crossroads if we're not already there now. The problem is, with so much of policing, is that we have a liberal, fluffy wokerati that prowl the corridors of policing power. They're afraid of their civil staff. They're terrified of them. They pander to politicians. And when it comes down to crimes like burglary, senior police officers this day and age will tell you everything you need to know about a smashed avocado buffet, but they know nothing about smashed window burglaries.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Peter Blexley, former police detective. I mean, Tom, I was burgled, I remember, quite a few years ago, and the police did come round and they spoke to us nicely and they said, we'll help you. Nothing ever came of it.
There are so many stories of people who sort of have, their doorbell has a camera in it, and they've got pictures of the person who did it, and somehow there are no leads that can be followed. I mean, really,
well, let us know if you've been impacted by burglary recently and in the past, and if you got any outcome. But coming up, the Church of England has been instructed to increase the size of its fund aimed at addressing the legacy of slavery to £1 billion. We're debating whether this is necessary next.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin, and this is your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Fog this morning, clearing away. For most, it's a dry and a bright afternoon, but there is rain in the southwest of England and South Wales. From this area of low pressure, the isobel squeezing together as well. So as well as rain, it is also turning windy. Some heavy pulses of rain as well, so not great on the M5 and parts of the M4 as that rain spreads into South Wales later. Ahead of it, for most, dry and bright. Some fog this morning, but that's clearing away now, and some good spells of sunshine, and temperatures struggling a little bit. Still single figures for many, maybe 11 or 12 in the southeast. Feeling colder with the wind and the rain in the southwest. Now, that rain spreads across all of Wales into the Midlands this evening, parts of southeast England, then to Northern Ireland and southern Scotland, easing off as it does so. As it moves through, leaving the moisture behind, it will turn quite murky for a while. Some fog patches, particularly by dawn over parts of the Midlands and eastern England. Turning quite chilly too for Wales and southwest England. Some pockets of frost here on Tuesday morning. A bit of a mishmash then to start Tuesday. Some fog around, but that should clear. Fairly damp over northeast England and eastern Scotland. Staying a bit damp across Aberdeenshire for most of the day. Some showers in the south for parts of Hampshire, moving up towards Kent. 1 or 2 heavy ones possible here. But for many, it'll be a dry and a bright day on Tuesday, and feeling a touch warmer too.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Yeah, so describe the contents of the letter for us, because it is quite strongly worded, isn't it? And it suggests that your property is empty. And what do they suggest it's going to be used for?
They say, as part of this process, Northamptonshire Council is identifying empty properties and sites within the area, with the aim of encouraging owners to bring premises back into use or to find alternative options for derelict sites. The resettlement team in Northamptonshire Council supports asylum seekers and refugees across 3 different projects: Homes for Ukraine, Afghan resettlement and asylum dispersal. At present, we are seeing a considerable increase in positive immigration decisions being made in favour of asylum seekers. So basically, they're wanting accommodation. But who goes around and assesses whether these properties are lived in or they are actually empty?
Clearly, Ted, no one had bothered to come and look at your house at all, had they?
What do you want now? Because clearly you are both very shaken by this letter, and that letter that you received in response has not gone far enough. Do you want an apology? What more do you want to see?
Well, she said here that she's, I sincerely apologise, this Lindsay Bellchambers, but I don't see, there was no explanation as to how they've come to say this property was empty, whether it was disused, whether it was unkempt, or what. If you go back through the history of the property, it's not been empty.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 1 o'clock on Monday, the 4th of March.
Extremism could be redefined for the first time in a decade as part of a wider crackdown on those who seek to undermine our democracy.
This comes as George Galloway is sworn into Parliament this afternoon, introduced by his old buddy Jeremy Corbyn. Will he be shunned, or will he find other allies in the Commons?
Reparations. The Church of England has been told that its proposed £100 million in investments is not enough to atone for its historical links to the slave trade, and that they should instead invest 10 times as much, £1 billion.
£1 billion, Tom. It's a bargain to atone for all your historical links to slavery, surely.
Oh, is this like the... So I sort of thought that the Church of England was established on Protestant ideas, in that giving away money wasn't the way that you could guarantee entry into heaven. I think that was what Martin Luther was all about when he nailed up his treatises, his 13 or whatever it was on the church door in some German state once upon a time. Wasn't that the whole point of? Well, I suppose the church.
But isn't this all about? This is all about investments, though.
Yeah, it's basically
improving the lives of people today.
Paying your way into heaven, right?
Paying your way into heaven. Well, let us know what you think about this. gbviews@gbnews.com. We're going to be having a bit of a fiery debate in just a little bit about this one. Should the Church of England be paying slavery reparations? And why does Justin Welby think it's such a fantastic idea? Let us know. gbviews@gbnews.com. But it's your headlines.
Emily, thank you. Your top stories from the GB Newsroom. The Chancellor says he wants to move the UK to a lower-taxed economy, but will only do so in a responsible way. Jeremy Hunt made those comments while visiting a plant in Wiltshire, where he also announced a £360 million funding boost for manufacturing. Income tax has reached an historic high, and while promising some cuts, the Chancellor's been trying to temper expectations ahead of Wednesday's budget.
We do want to move to a lower taxed economy, but we're only going to do so in a way that is responsible and recognises that there are things that taxes pay for, that we couldn't cut taxes by borrowing. We'll do so in a responsible way, but if we can spend money on public services more efficiently, then that will mean less pressure on taxpayers.
Former Home Secretary Dame Priti Patel says the government also needs to be more efficient when it comes to spending.
We have over 500,000 civil servants. Now, even to shave a degree off that would cut public expenditure by at least £1 billion, and that would be great. Back again in 2010, 2016, we had I think around 400,000 civil servants, and that saved a significant amount of money. The spending, the costs alone, I think, came down to something like £11 billion. This is where we have to be again, to be an agile government that's fit in the sense of financially sound money, conservative principles, but actually making sure the public keep more of their money.
George Galloway is due to be sworn in as the new Rochdale MP this afternoon. Arriving at the Commons this morning, he was asked how he feels about his comeback.
Well, I'll tell you what's happening inside. I always loved the building, the people in it, not quite so much.
Workers' Party of Britain leader won last week's by-election by more than 5,500 votes. The focus of his campaign was the ongoing war in Gaza, warning Sir Keir Starmer that Labour would pay a high price for enabling what he says is a catastrophe. Mr Galloway was a Labour MP for 16 years. He was suspended from the party in 2003 over remarks made at the start of the Iraq War. The Rwanda bill returns to the House of Lords this afternoon as the legislation enters its final stages in Parliament. Nearly 50 amendments have been put forward, with a number of votes expected today and on Wednesday. Among them, the government's assessment that Rwanda is a safe country for asylum seekers. It also comes almost 2 years after ministers first announced the plan to send some migrants to the East African country. The government has promised that the first flights will happen in the spring. Meanwhile, GB News understands around 330 migrants have been intercepted crossing the English Channel in 6 small boats so far today. That's after 327 made the crossing yesterday, the same day a 7-year-old girl died after a boat capsized. She'd been travelling with her pregnant mother, her father and 3 siblings when the boat got into difficulties in the early hours of yesterday morning. Education leaders are calling for a double-digit pay rise for all teachers across England. It's after the government said school salaries should return to a more reasonable level. The National Association of Head Teachers Union says England currently has the highest number of unfilled teaching posts in over a decade. It says a raise of at least 10% will counter the recruitment crisis. Nikki Haley has defeated Donald Trump in the Republican primary in Washington, D.C. It's her first victory over the former president in this year's campaign to become the Republican presidential candidate. She lost in her home state of South Carolina, but she's now the first woman to win a Republican primary in US history. The only remaining challenger to Donald Trump in the race, she claimed almost 63% of the vote. However, Mr. Trump has a significant lead over Ms. Haley and is likely to face Joe Biden in the election. And a Ferrari stolen from a former Formula One driver 28 years ago has been recovered by police. The sports car, stolen from Austrian driver Gerhard Berger, is worth around £350,000. The Ferrari F512M was one of two vehicles taken while their drivers were at the San Marino Grand Prix in 1995. The Metropolitan Police says officers received a report from the car maker in January following checks on a vehicle being bought by someone in the US through a UK broker last year. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts.
How safe are we in Britain? Well, the government is reportedly seeking to expand the definition of extremism for the first time in a decade to include those who seek to undermine British values and institutions.
Well, that would mean groups who use intimidation or violence could be excluded from taxpayer funding. And other things as well, yes. I think they will also be not able to stand for councils, local councils, and for positions of power, basically made pariahs.
I mean, it's extraordinary that we are talking in the context of groups that are involved in sort of violence receiving taxpayer funding as things stand. You'd think, how is this not already the rules?
But would it also exclude them, for example, going into Parliament and having an event? I don't know if Just Stop Oil's been invited into Parliament recently, probably has. But joining us now is Labour MP Steve McCabe. Steve, thank you very much for your time. What do you make of this story we're hearing, that the government, in response to what they see as the violence and intimidation of extremist groups in our democracy, are thinking about broadening that definition of extremism?
Well, I think we've certainly seen a number of things that most people would regard as unacceptable and beyond the bounds of legitimate protest. I suppose it depends exactly how the government defines this. It's easy to talk about it, sometimes a bit harder to define it in legislation.
Of course, the government's often come under criticism from civil rights and civil liberties groups when it's tried to be specific in defining or indeed criminalising certain forms of disruptive protest. Is it your view that this is a legitimate course of action for the government to be taking, that some of the protests that we've seen, whether it be from pro-Palestinian rallies to environmental protests, all of this sort of stuff that we've seen in the last few years, is it your view that it's legitimate to crack down upon it?
Well, I think where actions are designed to deliberately intimidate or threaten specific individuals, or where they go beyond the bounds of what might be classed as legitimate protests, targeting people's homes, their families, things like that, I don't think that is acceptable, and I don't think it should be allowed.
Yes, it's interesting because we've heard from a BBC presenter earlier today, I think, saying that actually it's totally legitimate for groups like Just Stop Oil, this is Chris Packham I speak of, totally legitimate for groups like Just Stop Oil to protest outside MP's home. This is all part of the democratic process.
Well, I think that is probably not the case. I think that is a massive intrusion. What a person does in their public life should be open to criticism and interrogation. But I think, people are entitled, and particularly their families, are entitled to a degree of privacy. So I don't know that I would find that acceptable myself.
We saw just a few days ago Just Stop Oil turning up to Keir Starmer's family home, broadcasting his front door on their social media channels. Do you have a message to Just Stop Oil and other groups who seek to intimidate MPs at their private family homes like this?
Well, we saw the Palestinian protesters projecting that stuff onto the House of Commons. We've seen environmental protesters at the Prime Minister's house and at Keir Starmer's house. As I say, I don't think that is acceptable. I think that is beyond the bounds of legitimate protest, and I don't think it should be allowed.
Steve, there are concerns from some of the electorate that the Labour Party may be weak on extremism. We've seen the difficulties the leadership has had when it comes to the issue of the war in Gaza, and that actually the Labour Party will find it very difficult to come out strongly against, for example, Islamist extremism.
Well, I think extremism is extremism. As I acknowledged at the start, we have to be clear about how we're defining this. But I don't care whether it comes from the right or the left or what particular brand it portrays itself under. I don't think we should tolerate these things. We already have laws to prescribe terrorist organisations. We should be willing to take action where it's required to protect the wider public.
Do you think there have been some instances where the police have been too timid, too reticent to take that sort of action that they could, under law, take with regard to some of the more extremist elements we've seen on protests in streets of cities across the United Kingdom in recent months?
Well, I think they've been asked to do an extremely difficult job, and, you know, it's a bit easy to be critical. I think they've been asked to do a very difficult job, but we've all seen examples where things have been allowed to go on that we might have expected to see earlier intervention on.
And just lastly, Steve, interesting, the news over the weekend, Israel accused of boycotting ceasefire talks in Cairo until they're given a list of hostages, the list of the named hostages taken by Hamas. Do you think that's fair?
Well, this is back to the crux of the problem about getting the ceasefire we all want. The hostages need to be released. It's not unreasonable that Israel knows how many are alive and how many will be released before it signs on the dotted line. I mean, most people would expect that to happen. And I hope that what Hamas are doing are indulging in brinksmanship and not deliberately setting out to scupper a ceasefire.
Well, big questions. But Steve McCabe, thank you very much for joining us, Labour Member of Parliament, of course. And we'll be speaking more about this and all the reverberating issues as we approach George Galloway's swearing in to the House of Commons. That's coming up a little bit later in this programme.
Yes, it'll be very interesting to see how he is received. But the RNLI today is celebrating its 200th anniversary and can boast saving nearly 150,000 lives during that time.
But increasingly the role of the lifeboat charity is being questioned because of how it assists the Border Force police to rescue migrants who are illegally crossing the English Channel.
Yes, well, joining us now is former RNLI crew member David Wimble. David, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, I don't know how long you were a crew member for, but perhaps you can give us a bit of insight into what it's like to work in the RNLI. There have been accusations made that the RNLI can function as a bit of a taxi service for migrants crossing the Channel. Do you think there's some truth to that?
Yes. First of all, a very happy 200th anniversary birthday to the RNLI. I spent the best part of 30 years starting off as a volunteer, as a 15-year-old, going down and sweeping out the boathouse down at Littlestone, where I live. And then went on to work for the RNLI on the River Thames, which was the world's busiest lifeboat station at the time. I think the ethos of the RNLI has always been the same from when William Hillary set it up 200 years ago. It's not to discriminate against anything, gender, politics or religion. It's all about saving lives at sea. And it's something that they've done a very good job of over the last 200 years. However, locally, certainly in the southeast where I'm based, some of the crews have voiced privately that they're a bit, disenchanted with the fact that they are being used, as you said, to quote you, a taxi service without any financial reward from the government. Which, if you take into account the fact that the RNLI is wholly funded by volunteer contributions, some people have even said, they leave legacies for them in their wills. Somebody that I know personally who was planning on leaving them a large amount of money, stated that they wouldn't do it all the time. They were acting as a taxi service. As you can see on the pictures at the moment, Dungeness lifeboat there. A couple of years ago, it's not so bad now, but a couple of years ago, they were sometimes launching 4 times a day. And it's a very expensive business. The government didn't give them any money for fuel or any help at all. And all the payments for that came from volunteers who may have done street collections, or as I mentioned, left money to the institution in their wills.
David, just on that point, I also read elsewhere that some people were giving more money since these accusations of it being a taxi service have come. So I guess it depends what side of that particular policy problem you're on.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. I've also heard that. But the biggest issue is that I'm not saying there's been a gagging order on RNLI crews, but many a time I've had reporters from other news services and newspapers come down, and they come to me because, one, locally I'm fairly well known for being involved with the RNLI previously, but two, because they can't get any comment from the RNLI. They go to the headquarters, they just say, we're all about saving lives at sea, which is totally correct. But I think it's a case of, some people might give them more money, but I would say the majority of people don't think that it's being used in the way that William Hillary set it up for, which was purely to save lives at sea.
Yeah, I mean, David, the crucial distinction here, distinction here, I suppose, is that whenever a boat is in distress, that is ultimately absolutely the role of the RNLI. But there are cases that have been reported of the Coast Guard, in some cases, simply spotting a boat that doesn't appear to be in distress and getting an RNLI crew sent out to take it back to the UK, to take it into shore. I suppose there's a distinction there between the boats that are in distress and the people that are struggling versus those that are just making their way across the channel.
OK, well, in defence of the RNLI, I mean, I think there's about 238 stations around the whole of the UK, and the migrant crisis probably reflects on about 4 or 5 of them, Dover being the main one, with Dungeness, Rye, and a few others. What I would say is that you can get into trouble very quickly. When this started, I remember about 6, 7 years ago, we had a dinghy rock up on the beach at Dymchurch, and at the time I said, within a few years, we could get 1,000 people a year coming over. And an editor of a local newspaper said that I was being, extreme with my views and a fantasist. Well, you've only got to look at the figures now, how many people are coming over. I don't want to get into the politics of why people are coming over, but when they started, we would have boats with 5, 10, maybe 20 people, whereas now some of them are like the big evacuation crafts that you get from airliners and cruise ships that can carry 60 people, and they are just overloading them so dramatically that they can get into trouble very quickly. So I guess from a Coast Guard point of view, launching a lifeboat is the right thing. But when you see in the summertime, Border Force are so busy with the few boats that they do have, that you hear stories of the French Coast Guard and the Navy literally meeting the boats halfway in the channel and handing them over. In fairness, we very rarely get boats actually turning up on the beaches here anymore. It used to be a daily occurrence, and it used to really annoy me that you could have 100, 200, 300 people in the day turn up, and you wouldn't read about it on any of the mainstream media. It was almost that it was, a given. And down here in the southeast, it really is notable. And we've had, in Kent, certainly in Romney Marsh, it's been pointed out that our MP, Damien Collins, whose ward is affected by more migrants landing than any other, has never been quoted, or you never see him on any of the media talking about it. And I think people are just...
You think they just don't want to put any opinion out there because they fear the consequences? Well, thank you very much for your time. Sorry to end it there, but David Wimble, it's been great to speak to you, former RNLI crew member.
The RNLI once saved my life.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well,
so you're one of those statistics?
That might be a bit dramatic, but they did come out and rescue me What
were you doing?
I was climbing up a cliff face. A bit of the rock fell off, and I fell down onto the sort of inaccessible rocky shore. And so a boat had to come out, take me round to Salcombe Harbour, went in the back of an ambulance, went to Plymouth Hospital, and I was completely battered up, completely bruised, but I'd scraped down the side of the mountain rather than falling and plummeting.
There you go. There's a good news story for the RNLI on its 200th anniversary.
Yeah.
Lots of you have been getting in touch saying it is a bit of a taxi service for migrants.
But they do
good work like this, saving Tom Harwood's life after he was very silly. After he was very silly. Well,
the rock was the problem. It broke off.
Yeah. Well, coming up, the Church of England has been instructed to increase the size of its fund aimed at addressing, guess what, the legacy of slavery. And they're going to be raising, well, as if they do what they're told, £1 billion. We'll be debating whether that's necessary next.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
People in this field and they talk about mental health assistance. And I know from personal experience within my own family circle that the help is just not there.
I know that with speaking to many families who've got autistic children and adults. They are really struggling at the moment, whether it's to do with education, getting a diagnosis. You know, once they get to 18 to 25, where's the help? There isn't the help there with social care. You know, I just set up a petition as well, who's going to look after my sons when I'm no longer around? Because that's that's the story and the question that's at the back of every parent's mind. It's just so hard at the moment, and lots of small charities are closing. And for me, they're the backbone of the society because they're the ones that speak, you know, to parents continually all the time, or autistic adults. So,
and why has it to be that way? And you know, we'll get government minister after government minister coming on and saying, we have greatly added to the resource here. We've had another 2.5 people we've hired last year, and whatever. I mean, they twist statistics and they make it all sound good. But I know from the work I do in the charitable world, and I know from people who I know personally, it just isn't there. So stop telling it is. And the thing is, the demand for mental health care has just ballooned.
The earlier you start working with children who are autistic, the better the outcomes. I've seen it myself, and I know it with my own sons. I shouldn't have had to set up a school and remortgage my home, you know, for my boys. And so many parents are still struggling, like 20-odd years from when my boys were diagnosed, and they're saying it's improving, and we're talking about awareness, we're talking about acceptance. It's hard because I'm juggling caring, I'm juggling, you know, taking him to college, picking him up. You know, I'm running a charity, I'm doing events. I know I'm a workaholic, but I'm very passionate and I'm very driven.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 25 minutes past 1, and you have been getting in touch. I'm actually quite surprised by the number of messages we've got when we mentioned the police addressing, or perhaps lack thereof addressing, burglaries in this country.
Yeah, absolutely doing nothing, it seems, when you call them up about a burglary. They might come round, but then nothing happens, no chasing of any leads. Kieran says, I had an Amazon parcel stolen from my doorstep. The perpetrator was caught on the Ring doorbell. These are these doorbells with the cameras. The footage was sent to the police. The offender is well known locally to authorities. Despite this, Kieran says, the police did not pursue it as they claimed the value was not enough, therefore meaning it was not in the public interest. It appears in London thefts beneath a certain value are decriminalised. It's not up to them to decide that it's not a big enough value, because if someone gets away with stealing an Amazon parcel, they'll move on to something else. Maybe, and it, you know, your car, your scooter, your bike, they might go into your house. I mean, I think they've already said, the 43 or so police forces said, we are going to pursue every crime. Clearly that just means giving you a number.
I had my mobile phone stolen when I first moved to London, and of course, what did I get? A crime reference number and nothing else. No follow-up.
Virginia says the police always investigate wealthy people's burglaries, but everyone else can be forgotten. Maybe some truth to that, particularly if it's high worth items, high value items, I should say.
Well, Dale says to alert neighbours and scare off burglars, he has an air horn in his house, also a German Shepherd and a baseball bat. So that's, well, Dale seems pretty prepared.
My dog didn't do much when a certain car got nicked from a certain drive. But there you go, some dogs are more useful than others, I guess. But the church...
What is it, a Chihuahua?
Moving on, the Church of England... They could be very loud. The Church of England has been instructed to increase the size of its fund aimed at addressing the legacy of slavery.
This directive comes from an independent review commissioned by the Church, which suggests that the current fund is insufficient to adequately address the historical implications of the Church's involvement with the slave trade.
Well, the Church of England has expressed its commitment to confronting its historical role in slavery, but is a boost to £1 billion realistic?
Well, joining us now is royal broadcaster and commentator Rafe Haydal-Manku and political commentator Femi Nylanza. Femi, let's start with you. Basically any institution in any Western country that is over a certain age is likely to have been tied up in this horrific industry at some point. Does that mean that reparations, hundreds of years later, are always necessary?
I'm glad you point that out, that the slave trade is something which is inexorably linked with British society at almost every level and in almost every institution. And I'm glad you acknowledge that. And of course, that means that has some implications which people might not like, which is that most institutions in the UK and the UK as a whole have this historical shame and have reaped rewards from this. But I think with the case of the church in particular, there's something... It's because we're not talking about Lloyds Bank. We're talking about an institution which claims to be a moral authority, an institution which claims to be a moral guide, a text which talks about freedom, which gives the idea of an individual who martyred themselves for the good of mankind. And we're also talking about an institution which claimed that some parts of humanity, in terms of institutionalized religion, in terms of the institutionalized UK Christian, like the Church of England, as it were, that claimed that people weren't fully human, that owned slaves itself, and that participated in this trade. And actually, when the abolitionist movement started in the UK, it wasn't the Church of England which actually drove it, it was the Quakers, which at the time were seen as kind of a radical offshoot in Christian circles. So I do think it's very key that we address this, particularly with the Church, because the Church claims to be moral and talks about retribution, talks about repenting for sin. That's a key tenet in Christianity.
Good point. Rafe, I'll have to bring in Rafe here because we're pushed for time on this one. Rafe, Justin Welby's very much invited this. He's commissioned this report into reparations and investments to atone for historical slavery links, and this is the outcome.
You know, just imagine how you would feel today if you were a victim of sex abuse at the hands of the Anglican clergy. In 2018, you know, Welby said that the church was going to commit £200 million to the victims of church abuse. Well, now 6 years later, those victims are still awaiting payment. You know, the Church of England has been dragging its heels and doing everything it can to avoid or delay making these payments. So how would you feel if you're one of those victims, your lives destroyed, perhaps with PTSD, to hear the church talk and, Femi talk about healing and repairing and atoning for sins about something from 200 years ago, and there are no victims alive today. Nobody alive today is a victim of slavery. We're talking about 8 generations ago, and the lives of the great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of slaves in the Caribbean are far better than they would have been had their ancestors never left Africa. That's an unfortunate fact people don't like to know. The life expectancy in the Caribbean is 15 years longer than in West Africa. The GDP per head is about 10 times as high as it was. And there's a £1 billion fund being allocated for all this by the Church of England. I think it's the ultimate in indulgence and immoral perversity, actually, to prioritize the lives of people in the 19th century over living victims in the 21st century. And I think the Church of England will do very well to remember Bible scripture, particularly Matthew, where it says, "You hypocrites, remove the plank from your own eye."
Well, Rafe, Femi, stay with us. We're going to get a news update. And thanks for kicking off this debate. We'll be back with both of you after our news update.
Good afternoon. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Chancellor says he wants to move the UK to a lower taxed economy, but will only do so in a responsible way. Jeremy Hunt made those comments while visiting a plant in Wiltshire, where he also announced a £360 million funding boost for manufacturing. Income tax has reached an historic high, and while promising some cuts, the Chancellor has been trying to temper expectations ahead of Wednesday's budget.
We do want to move to a lower taxed economy, but we're only going to do so in a way that is responsible and recognises that there are things that taxes pay for, that we couldn't cut taxes by borrowing. We'll do so in a responsible way, but if we can spend money on public services more efficiently, then that will mean less pressure on taxpayers.
George Galloway is due to be sworn in as the new Rochdale MP. Arriving at the Commons this morning, he was asked how he feels about his comeback.
Well, I'll tell you once I've been inside. I always loved the building, the people in it, not quite so much.
The Workers' Party of Britain leader won last week's by-election by more than 5,500 votes. The focus of his campaign was the ongoing war in Gaza, warning Sir Keir Starmer that Labour would pay a high price for enabling what he says is a catastrophe. Mr Galloway was a Labour MP for 16 years. He was suspended from the party in 2003 over remarks made at the start of the Iraq War. GB News understands around 270 migrants have been intercepted crossing the channel in 5 small boats today. We have had an update since then. It's 330. That's after 327 made the crossing just yesterday, the same day a 7-year-old girl died after a boat capsized. She'd been travelling with her pregnant mother, her father and 3 siblings when the boat got into difficulty in the early hours of yesterday morning. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts.
For a valuable legacy your family can own, gold coins will always shine bright. Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2675 and €1.1687 euros. The price of gold is £1,643.44 per ounce, and the FTSE 100's at 7,632 points.
Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Well, we promised we'd be right back, and here we are. Let's return to the royal broadcaster and commentator Rafe Haydelmanku and political commentator Femi Nylander. Now, Femi, you mentioned that slavery taints the United Kingdom's history. It taints every country's history with almost no exceptions across the world. But one thing the United Kingdom can say is that we were the first country to do the most to wipe out this awful trade. We were the first country to permanently ban the slave trade.
So I will address your point. I just want to address some of the points made by Rafe first. The idea that there's a false dichotomy between sexual assault and slavery. Slavery involved sexual assault on almost an unprecedented level. The slave trade involved a level of rape which is unbelievable, because these people were not seen as humans, they were seen as property, and therefore there's no criminal accountability to raping your property. So that's one thing to say. And another thing to say, of course, is that the Church of England has an annual endowment of about 9 billion, and that produces an income of about 1 billion. So the idea that it doesn't have enough money to compensate victims of sexual assault and compensate historical victims of slavery is also a false dichotomy. It has enough money to do
sorry
both
to interrupt,
as
but
well.
who are the current victims of slavery? Because apparently this fund will be used to invest in black-led businesses and provide grants. Are these black people who are current victims of slavery?
So we're talking about the descent. So again, it ties back again to what Rafe was saying about Africa and the Caribbean. People in the Caribbean and Africa have both today are feeling the consequences of the slave trade. When you take the best working age men out of a country on a mass scale, or out of a part of the world on a mass scale, that's going to impact its development. And from then, obviously, the UK and the British Church have had its own role in perpetuating colonialism in Africa as well, which has led to Africa being poorer than the Caribbean, as Rafe mentioned. But the Caribbean is also still poor, and the Caribbean is also still suffering the consequences of de-development.
Let's bring Rafe in on that point. The historical injustice of slavery is still present today and keeping people poor today. So therefore, the Church of England should cough up.
I mean, the reality is that that most Caribbean nations are middle-income countries, ranking higher on the United Nations Human Development Index than most countries in South and Central America, including places like Brazil, for example. And there are some Caribbean countries with income levels higher than Portugal, which was the world's greatest slave trading state, putting an end to the idea that slavery somehow fueled Europe's wealth. The reason the Caribbean is doing so well is because of colonialism and the British Empire. The English language, the common law, the institutions of parliamentary democracy and its police and its universities and education system, that's the inheritance that is benefiting the lives of the descendants of slaves in the Caribbean, and there is no way you can just deny those sorts of facts. But Amy made a very good important point here. This fund is going just to black-led schemes. Doesn't matter if someone is a descendant of a slave, if they have no connection to slavery, or indeed black people today, there are millions of them who descend from other slave owners. You have to remember there were more Africans kept in bondage in Africa by other Africans than were ever transported across the Atlantic. Why should they potentially benefit from these church funds? But that's what the Church of England is essentially saying. It's saying that all black people today are the victims of slavery, and that's absolutely absurd.
Rafe, can you give me an example of a single Caribbean nation with a GDP per capita higher than Portugal that isn't a tax haven for UK tax exiles?
Yeah,
can you give me an example of one? Because
Antigua and Barbuda, you can go to St Kitts and Nevis. They're all there.
Okay. So what are their GDPs per capita? How much higher on a GDP per capita level are they than Portugal? Because you're making these statements that have no basis in fact.
I've given speeches
moving on.
You can look at quite easily, but we're talking about 10 times higher GDP than Benin,
than Portugal. Then Benin, yes, but you're making claims that you're just not going to be able to back up because they're based in falsehoods. But anyway, the point
3 times before.
The point, of course, is that
you deny the facts.
The point, of course, Rafe.
Well, let Femi just finish.
You deny the reality that the Caribbean is much poorer than the West today, largely because of the structural adjustment loans given after the idea of enslaving a people, of stealing their labor, of dragging them to another part of the world, implanting them on that other part of the world, whilst at the same time killing a lot of the indigenous people there, because the Caribbean islands did have indigenous people that were killed by Europeans, and then they were replaced by Africans. So you've genocided off some indigenous people, and you've replaced them with Africans, and then you start to ask them to repay extra payment on loans that you've given them. This is what has kept the Caribbean poor, and there's plenty of examples of this. But the point is that black people today in the UK are disadvantaged because they are largely people who have come from these Caribbean nations, from these African nations. The UK does not produce anything really. It does not. It produces services, i.e. bankers, lawyers, this, that, and the rest. But what does the UK actually produce in terms of mineral wealth, in terms of
Of course, services are valuable, perhaps more valuable than
services
some
are valuable when you want to when you have lawyers that help facilitate tax save, when you have tax save, when you have lawyers that help facilitate tax evasion all over the world.
I wish we could talk about this for hours, but we're going to head off to a break. Thank you so much for your time, both Rafe and Femi. Stick with us here on GB News. We're looking ahead to George Galloway's entry to Parliament.
From 10 a.m. every Saturday, we want to make you think and we want to make you laugh.
So we will give you all the top stories.
Now we start with a story that has shocked the nation this week.
But we're also going to make it light and fun and bring some entertainment in to make your Saturday morning nice and restful.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
People in this field and they talk about mental health assistance. And I know from personal experience within my own family circle that the help is just not there.
I know that with speaking to many families who've got autistic children and adults. They are really struggling at the moment, whether it's to do with education, getting a diagnosis. You know, once they get to 18 to 25, where's the help? There isn't the help there with social care. You know, I just set up a petition as well, who's going to look after my sons when I'm no longer around? Because that's that's the story and the question that's at the back of every parent's mind. It's just so hard at the moment, and lots of small charities are closing. And for me, they're the backbone of the society, because they're the ones that speak, you know, to parents continually all the time, or autistic adults. So,
and why has it to be that way? And, you know, we'll get government minister after government minister coming on and saying, we have greatly added to the resource here. We've had another 2.5 people we've hired last year, and whatever. They twist statistics and they make it all sound good. But I know from the work I do in the charitable world, and I know from people who I know personally, it just isn't there. So stop telling it is. And the thing is, the demand for mental health care has just ballooned.
The earlier you start working with children who are autistic, the better the outcomes. I've seen it myself, and I know it with my own sons. I shouldn't have had to set up a school and remortgage my home, you know, for my boys. And so many parents are still struggling, like 20-odd years from when my boys were diagnosed, and they're saying it's improving, and we're talking about awareness, we're talking about acceptance. It's hard because I'm juggling caring, I'm juggling, you know, taking him to college, picking him up. You know, I'm running a charity, I'm doing events. I know I'm a workaholic, but I'm very passionate and I'm very driven.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
All eyes will turn to Westminster as controversial soon-to-be MP George Galloway is sworn into the House of Commons.
So technically he's not yet, is he?
Until he's sworn in, he's not an MP.
Not until he's sworn in. Well, questions have already arisen about how it'll go down in the chamber, and if the newly elected representative for Rochdale will take an oath and swear allegiance to the King and his heirs.
Well, joining us now is our political correspondent, Olivia Utley. Olivia, what can we expect this afternoon?
Well, it's already pretty controversial, George Galloway swearing into Parliament. It was rumoured that David Davis, the Conservative MP, would be accompanying Galloway. The protocol is that when an MP is sworn in, they are flanked on both sides by MPs who are already sitting in the House. Galloway claimed that David Davis would be coming with him. David Davis said that actually he was planning on bringing Galloway into the chamber, introducing Galloway to the chamber as it's known, because he believes believes in free speech and civil liberties. But when he heard what Galloway's deputy Chris Williamson said about Israel, that he doesn't condemn the attacks of October the 7th, he changed his mind. So David Davis will not be swearing George Galloway, and instead it'll be Jeremy Corbyn, old Jeremy Corbyn, and Peter Bottomley, the father of the house, who will be flanking George Galloway. Galloway has already said that he has 59 candidates of the Workers' Party who he wants to stand at a general election, which is obviously making MPs feel pretty jittery. The Prime Minister has not made any bones about his dislike of George Galloway, which is clearly shared by Galloway himself, returned with interest perhaps. So this idea of another 59 potential candidates fighting a general election is pretty nerve-wracking. It should be said, though, that the Rochdale election was pretty extraordinary. Labour's campaign completely imploded when they withdrew their backing for Azir Ali. And, of course, Galloway himself, like him or loathe him, is very charismatic and he's a fantastically good campaigner. So the idea that he could replicate that victory across the country seems to me quite unlikely. But even if there aren't another 59 Galloways waiting in the wings to come into Parliament, I think the original George Galloway himself is likely to cause quite a lot of controversy. We'll have to wait until his maiden speech, which will probably be in a few weeks, to get a real taste of what he's going to be about in Parliament. But this afternoon is going to be the very first introduction where we'll probably see a few indications of the future of a Galloway in Parliament.
Really, really fascinating. I'm looking forward to seeing all of the different options he has. Will he swear or affirm? Will he cross his fingers when he has to pledge his allegiance to the king? Yeah, really.
Thanks,
really...
Olivia. Thanks, Olivia Utley, our political correspondent there. Yes, it will be quite interesting. I have seen in the inbox that some people are, although this particular chap has said he doesn't like him, but he's looking forward to his speeches. Because, yes, he does pride himself on being a good orator, doesn't he? Even though he does repeat the same phrases he's said forever.
Two cheeks of the same, what was it now?
Backside.
But coming up, the senior judge who allowed 3 women convicted of terrorism offences to walk free from prison last month will be investigated over his alleged bias. This is GB News, Britain's election channel.
Headliners. Tomorrow's papers tonight, every night from 11 p.m.
Mail on Sunday, and the University of Buckingham is calling out wokery at the University of Cambridge. So I guess the culture wars must be almost over then, Josh.
Almost, yeah. Cambridge University discriminating against rich, white, privileged, privately educated men, claims...
The worst
which
kind.
is basically me. Claims Vice-Chancellor of rival institution, which is launching a degree course on the rise of woke culture. Now, I 100% agree with this. I applied to get into Cambridge, and I didn't get in because I was too thick.
Oh, wow, so it wasn't the DEI mafia?
No, unfortunately, it was pre-DEI. So it's like a double insult now.
Were you one of those guys who was like had a B average? You know, you look like you should be an A because you act like an A.
I act like an A.
You act
I've
like
got
an
glasses.
A. Yeah,
they're fake. I don't even have to. They don't even have lenses in them.
Lewis, do you think that this is a little bit cynical? Because I looked up this University of Buckingham, and they opened in 1973, and their tagline on the internet is "the home of the 2-year degree." They're trying to bring down Cambridge University with this.
Well, why not pick the biggest? I mean, that's why we should. We should be attacking the BBC 24/7 on this thing.
I thought we were.
We aren't. We don't mention it enough.
Listen.
What I found shocking about this story is Buckingham is the country's oldest private university, and was founded in 1976. Something is wrong there. What do you think? Was Oxford founded by the government? I don't think it was. Was Cambridge?
No, absolutely not. I looked up Cambridge was 1209.
Yes, exactly.
So you can
it
get...
wasn't a government
But this
grant.
is actually quite scary. They can do a course on the origins of the woke movement. I'm just saying, someone's going to have a degree, and our job is going to be under threat. They're going to know much more than us.
Never.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's 1:50. You're watching Good Afternoon Britain with me and Tom. Now, it's understood Tan Ikram, the senior judge who allowed 3 women convicted of terrorism offences to walk free last month, will be investigated over his alleged bias.
Well, the Deputy Chief Magistrate faced a barrage of criticism after he, quote-unquote, decided not to punish the women who had displayed paraglider images at a pro-Palestinian protest in London. Following the rather lenient sentencing, it emerged he had recently liked social media posts that branded Israel a terrorist state and called for a free Palestine.
Right, well, joining us now to discuss this is the barrister and writer Stephen Barrett. Stephen, great to speak to you on this one. You've been following what's been happening here. Now, how would this work? We heard from a number of top legal voices that he needed to be investigated because of this alleged bias. So what happens next with these sorts of things? How will this investigation look?
Well, we have a body called the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office, and it does work in tandem with the Ministry of Justice and the Lord Chancellor, and it can investigate. It's a messy situation. It's not quite as clean or as clear as it used to be when we just had a Lord Chancellor, but it is at least a body that can apply the test, and we have legal tests for what is real bias and also what is apparent bias, because justice must not merely be done, justice must be seen to be being done. So we take apparent bias as seriously as we would take real bias. You know, it's very, very important. I mean, it's ironic because we are where we are because, as I've banged on for years saying, the definition of political has collapsed. And so people don't understand that they're actually saying all sorts of political things all of the time. This judge contributed to something called the Bar and the Good Bench book or whatever it is, diversity in the judiciary. Now that looks dangerously close to being political. So we'll need to have an investigation of this judge, but really it's about preserving the whole of the judiciary, because they are one of the most important institutions we have as a country. And I should flag up to your viewers that just last week, something incredibly dangerous happened. This country and our constitution are now with 2 trains hurling towards each other with the ECHR, because what happened in the European Court of Human Rights was a Romanian judge said something outrageously political, which would be totally against our constitutional tradition, totally unallowable. And the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, said that it was within the free speech rights of that judge to say political things. Well, if that comes here, then I'm afraid the European Court of Human Rights will destroy our judiciary. And so it's a very big, very dramatic thing if that's going to happen. Let's cling to the old constitution. Let's have non-political judges. And when incidents occur like this one, let's investigate properly and fully, which is only right that occurs. You know, it must. If you want to protect the judiciary, we must investigate these matters properly.
We can't have judges can't have judges just revealing their political thoughts willy-nilly. That would be absolutely dreadful for justice and the perception of justice, which you say is just as important.
It would be. Stephen, just very briefly, what do you say to those on the other side of the fence here that say, actually, this is a political prosecution of a judge, that the people politicising this are those who've pointed out the social media likes of this particular judge?
Well, the only reason that they can really say that is because, again, the definition of what is or is not political has collapsed. It's collapsed into there are huge swathes of the country who still believe that it's political to say something that causes offence. And therefore, if you say something that doesn't cause offence, you're not being political. Now, that's not true. If you say something political and it doesn't cause offence, you've still said something political. And it's very important in this country because, of course, we have a long and noble tradition of the silent majority. So you can't use offence as a test because the silent majority probably won't say anything, even if you've deeply offended them. You know, it doesn't work as a test in a system. But we have the most respected judges in the world. Our judiciary are probably the most important institution in our country and in our constitution. If we want to preserve them, we must keep them out of politics.
Absolutely. And Stephen, you mentioned the silent majority, as Burke once wrote, while the crickets may chirp in the fields, the silent oxen are more in number. We'll be back right up with George Galloway after this.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Most of us having a dank, murky old night with rain spreading its way northwards, and then a few fog patches are likely to form. The rain starts off over Wales and southwest England, but through this evening spreading into Northern Ireland, eventually into southern Scotland, across the Midlands too, and outbreaks of rain across eastern England by the end of the night. As it clears, it will turn quite murky and misty, a few thick fog patches likely over the Midlands and eastern England by dawn. And as the skies clear over Wales and southwest England, some pockets of frost are possible as well. So a bit of a mishmash on Tuesday morning. It's a dull, murky, dank start over eastern England and eastern Scotland. A few mist and fog patches lingering through the morning. Should brighten up in many places, but some showers in the southeast. They could be on the heavy side. Some early rain for Northern Ireland, brighter here come the afternoon, but that rain will spread into western parts of Scotland. In the sunny spells, feeling a bit warmer than today, probably. The wind's a bit lighter as well. Temperatures getting up to 10, 11, maybe 12 Celsius. Wednesday also starts cold, in fact, a more widespread frost likely. Staying fairly cloudy in eastern England, a few showers here and there, but much of the west set to have a dry and a fine day on Wednesday with some decent spells of sunshine. Temperatures sticking in single figures where it stays rather drab, but with a bit of sunshine further west, 10 to 12 Celsius likely. That's all for now.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Mark Dolan and this is GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Yeah, so describe the contents of the letter for us, because it is quite strongly worded, isn't it? And it suggests that your property is empty. And what do they suggest it's going to be used for?
They say, as part of this process, Northamptonshire Council is identifying empty properties and sites within the area, with the aim of encouraging owners to bring premises back into use or to find alternative options for derelict sites. The resettlement team in Northamptonshire Council supports asylum seekers and refugees across 3 different projects: Homes for Ukraine, Afghan resettlement and asylum dispersal. At present, we are seeing a considerable increase in positive immigration decisions being made in favour of asylum seekers. So basically, they're wanting accommodation. But who goes around and assesses whether these properties are lived in or they are actually empty?
Clearly, Ted, no one had bothered to come and look at your house at all, had they?
What do you want now? Because clearly you are both very shaken by this letter, and that letter that you received in response has not gone far enough. Do you want an apology? What more do you want to see?
Well, she said here that she's you know, I sincerely apologise, this Lindsay Bellchambers, but I don't see, there was no explanation as to how they've come to say this property was empty, whether it was disused, whether it was unkempt, or what. If you go back through the history of the property, it's not been empty.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 2 o'clock on Monday, the 4th of March.
Well, extremism could be redefined for the first time in a decade as part of a wider crackdown on those who seek to undermine our democracy.
This comes as George Galloway is to be sworn into Parliament this very afternoon, introduced by his old friend Jeremy Corbyn. Will he be shunned or find other allies in the House of Commons?
And reparations. The Church of England has been told that its proposed £100 million in investments is not enough to atone for its historical links to the slave trade, and that instead it should invest 10 times as much, £1 billion.
Now, it's less than half an hour until we're expecting to see George Galloway make a triumphant return to the House of Commons, a place he was voted out of in 2015, 9 years ago.
Yes, he will be there. He'll be sworn in with Peter Bottomley by his side and also Jeremy Corbyn, his close ally, I'd say. But will there be other allies for George Galloway in the House?
George Galloway, in the speech that we're looking at images of now, said he wanted to build a grand coalition of voices who think like him on particularly the Palestine-Gaza issue, which is fascinating because some might say that Jeremy Corbyn, currently not a Labour MP, an independent MP, might he be minded to join such a grand coalition? And could a dramatic coalition of candidates, perhaps with different parties, perhaps under the same banner, all stand at the next general election and cause some upsets?
Well, let us know what you think about that. gbviews@gbnews.com. Do you think he'll find some friends in the House of Commons? I mean, it's often said that he's made a career out of cozying up to or defending Britain's enemies or hostile states and such things. He'd deny that, of course.
Found some friends in the Houthis who seem to have promoted him to the role of global statesman, saying that they'll release a ship if George Galloway sends a letter from the British government signed by George Galloway. I think they might be trying to stir.
Yes, and how much will he talk about the local maternity service in Rochdale, and how much will he talk about Gaza?
Well, one will be certainly more dramatic as a barnstorming speech. But anyway, let's get to all of that after your news headlines.
Tom, thank you. The top stories from the GB newsroom. The Chancellor says he wants to move the UK to a lower-taxed economy, but will only do so in a responsible way. Jeremy Hunt made those comments while visiting a plant in Wiltshire, where he also announced a £360 million funding boost for manufacturing. Income tax has reached an historic high, and while promising some cuts, the Chancellor's been trying to temper expectations ahead of Wednesday's budget.
We do want to move to a lower taxed economy, but we're only going to do so in a way that is responsible and recognises that there are things that taxes pay for, that we couldn't cut taxes by borrowing. We'll do so in a responsible way, but if we can spend money on public services more efficiently, then that will mean less pressure on taxpayers.
Former Home Secretary Dame Priti Patel says the government also needs to be more efficient when it comes to spending.
We have over 500,000 civil servants. Now, even to shave a degree off that would cut public expenditure by at least £1 billion, and that would be great. Back again in 2010, 2016, we had I think around 400,000 civil servants, and that saved a significant amount of money. The spending, the costs alone, I think came down to something like £11 billion. This is where we have to be again, to be an agile government that's fit in the sense of financially sound money, conservative principles, but actually making sure the public keep more of their money.
George Galloway is due to be sworn in as the new Rochdale MP. Arriving in the Commons this morning, he was asked how he feels about his comeback.
Well, I'll tell you once I've been inside. I always loved the building, the people in it, not quite so much.
The Workers' Party of Britain leader won last week's by-election by more than 5,500 votes. The focus of his campaign was the ongoing war in Gaza, warning Sir Keir Starmer that Labour would pay a high price for enabling what he says is a catastrophe. Mr Galloway was a Labour MP for 16 years. He was suspended from the party in 2003 over remarks made at the start of the Iraq War. The Rwanda bill returns to the House of Lords this afternoon as the legislation enters its final stages in Parliament. Nearly 50 amendments have been tabled, with a number of votes expected today and on Wednesday. Among them, the government's assessment that Rwanda is a safe country for asylum seekers. It comes almost 2 years after ministers first announced the plan to send some migrants to the East African country. The government has promised that the first flights will happen in the spring. Meanwhile, GB News understands around 330 migrants have been intercepted crossing the English Channel in 6 small boats so far today. That's after 327 made the crossing yesterday, the same day a 7-year-old girl died after a boat capsized. She'd been travelling with her pregnant mother, her father and 3 siblings when the boat got into difficulty in the early hours of yesterday morning. Education leaders are calling for a double-digit pay rise for all teachers across England. It's after the government said school salaries should return to a more reasonable level. The National Association of Head Teachers Union says England currently has the highest number of unfilled teaching posts in over a decade. It says a raise of at least 10% will counter the recruitment crisis. Nikki Haley has defeated Donald Trump in the Republican primary in Washington, D.C. It's her first victory over the former president in this year's campaign to become the Republican presidential candidate. She lost in her home state of South Carolina, but she's now the first woman to win a Republican primary in US history. The only remaining challenger to Donald Trump in the race, she claimed almost 63% of the vote. However, Mr Trump has a significant lead over Ms Haley and is likely to face Joe Biden in the election. And a Ferrari stolen from a former Formula One driver 28 years ago has been recovered by the Met Police. The sports car, stolen from Austrian driver Gerard Berger, is worth around £350,000. The Ferrari F512M had been shipped to Japan and was brought to the UK last year. The Met Police says officers responded after receiving a report in January that it had been bought by someone in the US through a UK broker. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Tom.
Now, how safe are we in Britain? The government is reportedly seeking to expand the definition of extremism for the first time in a decade to include those who seek to undermine British values and institutions.
Well, that would mean groups who use intimidation or violence could be excluded from taxpayer funding and many other things, I'm sure. Well, joining us now is Telegraph columnist Tim Stanley. Tim, thank you very much for joining us on this. Now, you wrote a very interesting piece in the Telegraph, I think published this morning, about how you thought the Conservatives haven't done an awful lot about this problem and how Rishi Sunak's speech was more talk, perhaps less action than what's needed.
It depends on what the nature of the action is. As I wrote in the column, he seems to be proposing that we will defend British freedoms by clamping down on our civil liberties. I'm not in favour of that. I think look, the background to the rise of extremism in this country is growing political polarisation, the consequences of mass migration, and a general loss of sort of faith in British civic life and in British history and tradition. Those are not things I think can be solved by a government in the last few months of its life, trotting out a couple of bits of legislation which potentially make it harder to be critical of British institutions. I'm not in favour of that. I just think it's all too little too late, and the conversation that he's proposing we have is the wrong one. And if you go back to his speech last week, he made reference to George Galloway having been endorsed by Nick Griffin. So what? George Galloway didn't seek that endorsement. Nick Griffin is a nobody, politically a completely dead figure who is currently flirting with political Islam because it's one latest twist in the turn of British far-right activism, but none of it really matters. I got the sense the Prime Minister couldn't put his finger on what extremists are, let alone what he's going to do about it. And I'm not in favour of legislation being rushed through just to look like the government's finally getting on top of a decades-long problem.
But isn't one of the big problems here that people don't feel like they can talk about the extremism problem in certain sections of society in the United Kingdom and across the West more generally? People tiptoe around the edge of the issue, perhaps out of fear for their own safety.
Well, precisely. They are worried about two things. One, being attacked for what they say, quite literally, physically. And secondly, they're worried about the state clamping down on what they say, whether it be through facing some kind of penalty in employment or even through police investigation. So when the government comes out and says it's going to have a broad war on extremism, I suspect that's going to include people who are critical of extremists. Because the argument will be that if the problem is the radicalisation of British politics and undermining institutions, well, someone who comes out and says, look, I think we need a really strong solution to the problem of extremism, it's been embedded in institutions, we need to take another look at it. One could argue that that person is themselves an extremist. And I would remind you that in the last week, the Labour Party has been arguing that the real extremists in British society right now are the Tory party. They're the ones sowing division. Well, Labour's about to form the next government. So by its definition of extremism, a great number of people who are on the centre-right could find themselves suddenly labelled an extremist. So I just want everyone to step back from this. Do we need new legislation? Do we need this general talk about extremism in society? Or do we need an honest, frank conversation about where we are growing apart as a country? Because that's obviously happening.
Tim, I mean, what is the answer there? A frank conversation? Is there any answer? Is this just the consequence of mass immigration, that you end up having a less socially cohesive society and that's just worth it for the benefits?
There are some things that one just simply has to accept. If we are a multicultural society with open borders, then you do welcome into your society communities which have different values, and tensions will arise from that. We also have to accept that we are currently divided because the world is going through a war in Gaza which is incredibly divisive and about which people have very strong opinions. There's been an atmosphere in the last week of almost George Galloway doesn't have a right to sit in Parliament, or that his constituents don't have a right to vote for him. That's nonsense. This is a one-off election. I'm sure Labour will take the seat back in Rochdale at the next election. He is not going to form a grand coalition within Parliament. He's going to be isolated. He'll make great fodder for journalists, but he's not going to turn politics upside down. And his coalition outside of Parliament will make no difference to the next general election because it's going to be about kicking the Tories out and electing Labour. So this is a moment in our history, but it's an important moment to think about and ask difficult questions about why is this happening? And it might come back to some of those things that centrist politicians regard as axiomatic and good, like mass migration.
Frankly, is George Galloway perhaps not the person that will deliver that wider conversation, but a symptom of what could be in the future? What I'm trying to say is that George Galloway does not make any bones about his position. He knows that he's speaking primarily to one community and primarily for one community, and he has been electorally successful off the back of that. Might we see precisely the opposite happen with other communities in the United Kingdom and start seeing people who are speaking as forthrightly as George Galloway does about Israel, about Muslim countries?
That might happen, and one hopes it does not happen. It, of course, is happening in little bits here and there. Another big electoral issue on the doorstep for many communities is Kashmir. It doesn't get nearly the amount of attention as Israel, but my goodness, local politicians do play upon it on both left and right, which is rather troubling. But remember, Britain has always had sectarianism. To those who say we've not been through something like this before, I just point at Northern Ireland. We do. There are members of Parliament who don't take their seats because they don't support the British state, Sinn Féin. So we've always had an issue like this. It's just that we're seeing a new variation of it. And I don't know what the solution to it is, but I think trying to put it under the umbrella of a vague term of extremism, as if British society, there are individuals within it who are just going a little bit too far, I think is nonsense, let alone the threat of legislation that would mean silencing them by force of the state.
Well, Tim Stanley, columnist at the Daily Telegraph, really appreciate your time. I know you've got to run off back to Parliament and see George Galloway get introduced, as we're looking forward to.
I don't know what you do about this. I mean, you have, often on the left, people who are very keen to degrade our history, so you don't have that strong sense of British history, values, traditions. So therefore, you're asking people to integrate into something that seems quite nebulous. When you ask people, what does it mean to be British? People give really rubbish answers. They're not sure. Oh, it means eating fish
fair play
and chips.
and equality and, like, I mean, surely any decent country would say that that's the value of their country. I think you're absolutely right, Emily. What makes Britain special and unique and different is our history, our proud history. And more people sharing in that history should be a good thing, rather than defining themselves against it. And I wonder if there's an issue here. If we say that migration equals multiculturalism, we're doing a disservice to the countries that have been built on migration, but have been built on uniculturalism. Everyone buying into one sort of idea of, for example, what it is to be American. I mean, America is a nation of immigrants built upon an idea of a homogenous society. And I wonder if there's something that we could learn there in the United Kingdom.
Yes, having something strong and proud to integrate into would be a good start. But anyway, the Chancellor will deliver his spring budget this Wednesday, a final opportunity for the government to lay out their plans ahead of the next general election.
And there's been much speculation about, drumroll, tax cuts, with Jeremy Hunt hinting at his fiscal plans earlier today.
We do want to move to a lower taxed economy, but we're only going to do so in a way that is responsible and recognises that there are things that taxes pay for, that we couldn't cut taxes by borrowing. We'll do so in a responsible way. But if we can spend money on public services more efficiently, then that will mean less pressure on taxpayers.
Less pressure on taxpayers sounds nice, but let's get the truth with our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, with On the Money. Liam, are we skint?
We're not skint, Tom. We're the fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world, depending on how you measure it. But in recent years, GDP, the sum total of goods and services in the economy, all transactions, has grown very, very slowly. And GDP per head, which is the really crucial measure of living standards, has actually shrunk for the last 6 or 7 quarters, so for getting on for 2 years. And that's why a lot of us feel a lot poorer. Things are getting so much more expensive. Real wages after inflation haven't quite caught up. And of course, the government, when growth is slow, when the economy isn't expanding, but there's ever more demand for public services, has less and less tax revenue with which to pay for those public services. Yet the tax burden, the share of the entire economy that is tax, is approaching a 70-year high, despite the fact that the Tories, traditionally the low-tax party, have been in power either on their own or in coalition for 14 years. That's why Jeremy Hunt's under enormous pressure, not just from his own backbenchers, but from many traditional centre and centre-right voters to lower taxes. But he's having a hard time convincing himself that he's able to lower taxes when this budget statement is given later this week. Let's have a look at some of the main points. The budget statement is on Wednesday. That's the 6th of March. We're expecting it to be sometime just after midday, after parliamentary questions. And the speculation is that Jeremy Hunt may cut 1 or 2p off the main 20% rate of income tax. But there's also speculation he may instead cut national insurance instead. That's kind of a tax in all but name. He cut the main rate from 12 to 10% national insurance that came in January. In order to pay for these tax cuts, he wants to raise certain taxes on the wealthy, so particularly airfares, business class airfares, the surcharge that you pay if you're wealthy enough to turn left as you get on the plane rather than turn right. And he also wants to end or certainly water down the so-called non-dom tax status. That is a regime that allows wealthy foreigners who are resident in the UK but not domiciled. Ask a tax lawyer what the difference between those two is. It's quite metaphysical. They can pay very little tax on their overseas earnings. Labour wants that non-dom tax status to end. The Tories are sort of matching them if the speculation is true. So money's tight. That he hasn't got much fiscal headroom to play with, even though the Tories have a general election coming up, probably in the autumn, and they instinctively want to cut taxes. The Chancellor is saying we probably can't afford to cut taxes very much now.
Yeah, and of course it doesn't help us as well that there are so many people out of work at the minute. Thank you very much, Liam Halligan there, our economics and business editor. A little preview for the budget.
And in 10 minutes, we're expecting George Galloway to be sworn into the House of Commons. Stay with us.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg's State of the Nation, Monday to Thursday from 8 p.m.
You're now in exile. I imagine it wouldn't be safe for you to go back to Russia. Can I ask you if you feel safe personally, and what do you think can be done to remove Putin, or is he going to be there for as long as he wants?
I think that is, of course, fundamental question. It is there should be pressure inside Russia and outside. Inside Russia right now, it's impossible because Putin put all leaders in jail and some of us just abroad. You know, just two were already killed. Mr. Nemtsov, Boris Nemtsov, my friend, my collaborator on my party, was killed on the walls on Kremlin. Alexei Navalny was killed in jail and in the camp. And that is, the people live in fear to identify themselves as protesters, to identify themselves as against Putin's regime, etc. That's why today there is no chance for opposition to rise inside Russia. But outside, of course, this war against Ukraine, that is the fundamental issue for all foreign leaders. And in fact, just support of Ukraine and not to let Putin to destroy Ukraine, to defeat Ukraine. That is an important issue because just Ukraine, that's not just in Ukraine, war in Ukraine. Ukraine just fighting for their territorial integrity, but fighting for the whole European countries because after Ukraine, other countries could appear, other subject of aggression could be, and Putin easily could try to test Article 5 of NATO Charter. It could be one of the small countries of Baltic states.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my new show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m, where real people get to meet those in power and hold them to account. Every week, we'll be hearing your views from up and down the country in the real world. Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain, 23 minutes past 2. And now, the Conservative Member of Parliament and former Minister for London, Paul Scully, is set to stand down before the next general election.
Yes, and I'm pleased to say Paul Scully joins us now. Paul, why are you deciding to step down then?
Hi, both of you. Look, I'm not stepping down before the next election. I'm standing down at the next election, just to be clear. There are no by-elections or anything like that. I'm just not going to be standing. Look, it's a while in the making. You know, I think I lost my mojo sometime last year, and it's not right that as the, you know, you look at what's happening in the party, I think Sutton and Cheam is eminently winnable, but the next 5 years I think are a challenge for me personally, so it's not right that I'm there when someone else should probably take up the cudgels and move things forward. I'm not going to be... Yeah.
So it's not got anything to do with the heat you got after your comments on the old no-go areas?
No, I'd already told my association chairman the weekend before, actually, that of my intentions, and actually the only reason that it's taken so long to go public is because I didn't want it to be associated with that, because that was not anything to do with my decision. It has, however, confirmed that I've made the right decision, to be honest, because I just think there's a big disassociation, especially on social media and these kind of things, when you're speaking about something so important as community cohesion, to try and boil it down to 4 inappropriate words that I chose rather than the 12-minute interview that I get when I was arguing exactly the opposite of what I've been accused of doing. I think it's just born on my frustration of politics as a whole and where we are going, where we risk going as a party over the next 5 years if we don't up our game and create a vision, a different positive vision for the country.
No, it's so easy to see how so many of your colleagues and you yourself have become frustrated with the way that politics works, with the ability of getting legislation through, or even staying united as a party. All of those, I imagine, have fed into this atmosphere that has seen so many of your colleagues deciding that this is their last election to fight. But Paul, you say that the party needs to be rebuilt and that it needs energy and that it needs ideas and that it needs the sorts of ideas that you're espousing. I read your Twitter thread saying that it's important to stay within the bell curve of British public opinion. Surely you're an important voice in that fight.
I am, but, you know, I'm 56 and I don't want to retire as a politician, so I was probably only going to do one more term anyway. I'm not going to be part in that of the long-term solution from the inside of the party. It doesn't mean I'm not going to be having my say and getting involved in some way, shape or form. But I think the problem with being an MP is this odd job where your notice period is 5 years. Unless you're going to do a Boris or a Nigel Adams or Nadine Dorries or the like, I have to sign up for another 5 years, and that's just not something I particularly want to do personally. And for the sake of my partner and family and friends, I think, I want to be able to move on to pastures new, but helping the party rebuild, because you have to do it from the centre ground, taking people with you. It's not losing a battle of the battle of ideas, but it's just not diving into an ideology without taking people with you, rather than just sitting in the deep end and saying the water's warm, come in. Start in the centre ground and move people with you wherever you want to go.
Well, you've described yourself as a moderate voice, and you wrote a piece, I think, in The Telegraph following the heat over the no-go areas comments, saying that, you know, you've had huge support for Muslim communities in the past, and because of being called an Islamophobe now, you just want to retreat.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously knew I was making my announcement at some point when I wrote those words, but it was more I was being very specific about that debate in particular, because 15 years of working with British Bangladeshis, British Pakistanis, with the Ahmadi community, Muslim community, it's been really difficult to then go through that process. But as I say, all that's doing is confirming my decision. It's not making my decision, which was already made up, and the process started before then.
And just finally, of course, you did stand to be Mayor of London. You weren't selected for the shortlist, so no Conservative members got to vote for your candidacy in the end. It was all a big mess. But do you rule out standing for any non-parliamentary roles in our politics in the future?
I may stand for something. I don't know is the honest answer in the future. You know, certainly this mayoral election, there's been touted around that I'm going to stand as an independent. I'm not going to be. But, you know, let's see what we do in the future. London is really important to me. I spent 4 years as Minister for London. And when London does well, the UK does well, and there are 9 million people that are so different from each other but come together to make this most amazing city. So I care passionately about it, and I want the Conservatives and everybody, frankly, to do the best for this city. And I think we're just letting them down at the moment by allowing Sadiq Khan a comparative free run.
Scully for London 2028. Did I hear that? I'll be the first to say it. Paul Scully, thank you so much for joining us and talking through your decision.
Very interesting indeed. Well, looking ahead to this is GB News political editor Christopher Hope.
We'll be crossing across
speaking
to Christopher Hope because Parliament is facing a pretty big moment in the next few minutes. We're expecting George Galloway to enter the House of Commons for the first time in almost a decade. Be introduced on one side by Sir Peter Bottomley, the father of the House, and the other side, Jeremy Corbyn, now independent Member of Parliament for Islington North, but former leader of the Labour Party, of course.
Yes, well, George Galloway will be there. We'll be bringing you live from the House of Commons, everything that goes with it, whether he swears allegiance to the King and his heirs and successors and all of that, and whether there will be some kind of reception for him, whether a positive one or a negative one. Will he find allies in the Commons? I think he will, among some of the momentum lot, those that are left anyway.
I'm interested to see if it will be a full chamber, if it will be a busy chamber. I know lots of my friends in the press gallery are crowding in there to watch it. So we know that the press gallery will be very full. But will the green benches of MPs be particularly full? Will people want to be seen there? I'm not sure.
I think it'll probably be... Yes, they probably won't turn up at all, will they, probably?
Well, I don't know. I think...
Just the press.
There have been reports that he's been chatting away to Diane Abbott in Portcullis House, which is sort of the big atrium where members of Parliament meet and lunch. But Christopher Hope has been skulking the corridors of Parliament all day for us. And Christopher, just firstly, I want a line from you on Paul Scully. I mean, he's perhaps not the biggest household name in politics, but anyone who's worked in Westminster over the last decade will have known him and known his work.
That's right, and hi both. Yeah, he's a very decent man, really. I think someone who will be missed in public life. He was a former London minister, a post office minister for a period, a tech minister. He ran, didn't he, to be the Tory candidate to beat Sadiq Khan. Didn't get that, lost out to Susan Hall. He's been critical of Susan Hall being a weak candidate since then. Many would agree with Scully's analysis. He's lost his marriage and 2 friends have been killed as MPs. He's had quite a life, I think, and he felt... he decided to go well before the misspeak last week about no-go areas. He tried to explain what he meant by that, I think, just to you on air just now. I think he feels that there's increasingly a lack of nuance on social media. People's confirmation bias is added in, and he frankly wants a different life, age 56, and I think all the best to him.
Yes, he sees himself as a moderate voice, clearly misunderstood at some points. At least that's what he makes of it. But George Galloway, Christopher, George Galloway is very much back, and he's going to be sworn in very, very imminently.
That's right. As one MP exits, George Galloway arrives in Parliament this afternoon. There'll be a press conference with him around just after 3 o'clock. We'll bring that to you live at GB News. And we're going to see him shortly being sworn as an MP. It'll be the 4th time he's sworn in a different seat. He, along with Winston Churchill, are the only 2 MPs in history to have represented 4 different towns and cities in the country. There you have him now on screen now in his fedora. Whether he wears his hat in the House of the Commons chamber, I don't know. I think he wears that because he was subject to a physical attack about 10 years ago, and it may cover up some scarring. I don't know why he wears the hat. I think that's why he wears it. It certainly gives him a kind of, certainly a dramatic profile in the House of Commons, and he's quite a speaker. So I don't think he'll say anything in the Commons today. But he will certainly make his presence known. And as you say, the sketch writers, the journalists in the press gallery where I work normally are sharpening their pens as we speak.
Christopher, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's a rule against wearing hats in the House of Commons. I remember Peter Bone, the former Member of Parliament for Wellingborough, standing up at Prime Minister's Questions at one point, popping on a hat on his head for Wear a Hat Day and being reprimanded by the Speaker for such intransigence.
Yes. But yeah, but I think if it's for medical reasons or for a reason that's understandable, that might be different, I think, Tom. Of course, Sikhs can wear turbans and the rest in the house, and that's all, of course, that's fine. In the old days, of course, Tom, you might remember this, on Budget Day, MPs would wear a hat to symbolise where their constituency is. So MPs with mining in the area would put a miner's helmet on. And that was certainly that was allowed, I think, on certain days. But
my favourite one, Christopher, was up until Blair got in and changed all the rules. If you wanted to make a point of order during a division, you had to wear a top hat, and they kept a pop-up top hat.
Yes.
I think the clerks of the House had, and they had to throw the hat across, catch the hat, pop out the hat, put the hat on in order to make the point of order. It's such a grand tradition that we sadly lost in the modernisation of 1997.
Yes. I think I saw it come back during the Brexit wars, I think, Tom. I think they tried to bring in the hat again, and it was chucked about a bit at some point when it was late night sitting. So in our country, these things
Chris, I'm going to interrupt you. Galloway is in the Commons.
Bear true allegiance to His Majesty King Charles, his heirs and successors, according to law. So help me God.
Well, there we have. George Galloway has sworn allegiance to the King. He's chosen to swear, not affirm. That is the more traditional way to do it. And I think we could see in his hand there the Holy Bible. So very, very interesting. He's done the more traditional choice. Now, a lot of socialist members of Parliament choose to affirm rather than to swear by Almighty God, but he has chosen to swear, which I think perhaps speaks to some of his traditionalist, small c conservative politics, which has actually probably been underreported. He, of course, did do one letter and leaflet to more working class areas of Rochdale, saying he would crack down on grooming gangs.
Yes, he's talking to Lindsay Hoyle there, the Speaker. He's not wearing a hat. So there you go, that puts that to bed. But he's got his pass around his neck already. His
we now
MP's
come
pass.
to questions.
And that was that. Very interesting that he chose to swear. He didn't cross his fingers.
No.
And he appeared to be holding a Bible. Christopher Hope.
That's right, and I'm trying to find out who maybe accompanied him into the House, because over the weekend, David Davis, the former Brexit Secretary, had been tipped as someone who might do that. That didn't happen. Was it Jeremy Corbyn? The pictures came to us quite late, I think.
We could see Peter Bottomley in the corner of the chamber. It seemed like that could have been. I'm just going to get it up for you now, Chris, but do continue.
Yeah, Peter Bottomley, of course, is the father of the House of Commons. He's the longest-serving MP, and he probably felt that he's got to welcome the newest MP, who is George Galloway. Whether I think Jeremy Corbyn did it the same, you've got we'll wait and see if that's the case. But yeah, he's now going to be an MP. You saw him there with his familiar green and white lanyard, which signifies being an MP in the House of Commons. He didn't wear his hat. That may be a respect thing, because of course he was swearing down the Bible an allegiance to the King. We'll see if he wears it in the future. But I think he's going to be an interesting figure in the House of Commons, which will make Parliament more interesting for good or bad, because I think there'll be plenty of MPs, certainly Jewish MPs, who will be concerned about his arrival in Parliament. You heard what the PM said last week on Friday. He thought it was beyond alarming that Mr Galloway was back in Parliament. We'll see how his first intervention is.
I can confirm it was not Jeremy Corbyn. It looks to me like it's Neil Hanvey, the Alba Party MP, who stood beside him as he was being introduced. I think that's Neil, alongside Sir Peter Bottomley. Peter Bottomley wearing his Ukraine tie. But yes, the Alba Party MP alongside the father of the House.
Yes, I'm sure we can get that for you again, so you can see at home.
Well, that makes some sense, because he'll be sitting with MPs from the Alba Party and other independents on that corner of the House of Commons. So, in a sense, that was someone who'll be sitting with him in Parliament, almost welcoming him to the bench where they sit.
Well, good to get all of that summed up. I think perhaps surprising to some that he chose the most traditional thing to do when when swearing in as a Member of Parliament. But Christopher Hope, thank you very much for your reaction.
I don't know. I think he knows that it would appear perhaps a little childish if he didn't, so he wants to do it properly. And now he's back in the Commons.
Lots of principled Republicans choose to affirm.
Well, I don't know if he is a Republican, is he?
No, I don't think he is, actually.
Well, there you go.
He is.
And presumably he'll now be given one of the very tiny little offices there in Parliament. But anyway, still to come, the Church of England is being urged to boost its fund for slavery reparations. Guess what? To £1 billion. You're watching Good Afternoon Britain. We're on GB News.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Farage, Monday to Thursday from 7 p.m.
We're always told that there is a huge need for care workers in Britain. We're always told that the salaries just aren't big enough against the benefit system for British people to want to do that work. And there probably is some real truth in that. And yet, if up to 25% of those that come are acting illegally, and it would seem, up until now, that in some areas, foreign care workers come in, but bring in almost the same number of family members with them, that we need to have a proper debate about this. I'm very pleased to be joined by Mike Padgham, chair of the Independent Care Group. If I accept those arguments for a moment, how can it be that the system is so lax that up to 25% are found by the Inspector of Borders and Immigration to be working illegally?
Well, good evening to you, Nigel. It was good to join you. I mean, those figures are shocking to me. When I looked at it today, when I saw that 275 visas had been issued to a care home that didn't even exist, and a further over 1,000 people joined a company that only had previously 4 staff in it, it makes me wonder the bureaucracy of the Home Office didn't think to check that these companies exist in the first place, because it should be quite straightforward. If people are providing care, they're regulated by the Care Quality Commission. It's a simple phone call to check and double check. Sadly, there seems to have been very many loopholes at the beginning. I believe that's been tightened now, but I can't understand it, because all the providers that are doing it in the proper way have to go through quite a rigmarole to actually get approved, and it takes months. So it beggars belief that this has happened and people have been approved for a company that doesn't even exist.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. It's 20 to 3, and the Church of England has been instructed to increase the size of its fund aimed at addressing the legacy of slavery.
Yes, this directive comes from an independent review commissioned by the Church itself, which suggests that the current fund is insufficient, but is a boost to £1 billion from £100 million completely unrealistic. £1 billion. Well, joining us is journalist and broadcaster Peter Whittle. Peter, what do you make of this? We've heard from Justin Welby many a time about the historic wrongs of slavery. He's apologised at length for the Church's role and links and whatever else. And now he's potentially going to take this advice. What do you think?
Well, Emily, I think it is quite typical now of the Church of England, it has to be said. Basically, this is a fund which they're aiming to make 1 billion, as you say, rather than 100 million, to expunge the moral sin of slavery. They're going to make sure that there is investment in black-led businesses all over the world. I mean, look, where do you start with this? The fact is that the Church of England has been pretty much captured by what we would call critical race theory, right? It's completely, from top to bottom, infected with guilt, white guilt. And you would say, would you not, that if you're going to try and raise $1 billion, you might want to use it for the current day scourge of slavery, as it is in the world today. It's worse than it's ever been, in fact. It's just that this is always entirely on this one particular aspect of the trade, which was the transatlantic trade. And in fact, the church obviously is completely obsessed with this, and somehow by spending money, it's a form of reparations. That's what it is. Basically, they are going to try and expunge their guilt. This comes at a time when the Church of England is taking on, get this, a deconstructing whiteness officer. This was announced last week in the Midlands, right? This should tell you basically everything about where the Church of England is now. You know, this is something which sees whiteness as some kind of pathological state. And so what have we had as well this past week, this past month, indeed, from the Church of England? We've had that they are helping illegal migrants, for example, with their so-called conversions to Christianity in order to make sure that they get successful applications. We hear nothing from the church about all the various other things that we are really faced with at the moment. Serious problems such as the threat of Islamism, for example, the fact that we might have a new blasphemy law coming in under Labour, which, frankly, you would think the church should have something to say on. But in fact, no. What it does, it goes back to these past acts such as the transatlantic slavery trade. Not once as well has there been any acknowledgement, and you think this would be celebrated, that this country abolished slavery. You know, it abolished slavery. It was the first country to do so, and essentially then went around the world, used its Royal Navy, go around the world to basically make sure that that abolition was enforced all over the world for 50 years after. But basically, the church isn't interested in that. It's interested in basically enforcing critical race theory, which sees basically white people as inherently racist.
Yeah, no, it's an absolute... it's a fundamental point that you raised there, Peter, that this country did more than any other to wipe out the evils of the slave trade. Lord Liverpool made it a condition of the Peace of Vienna at the end of the Napoleonic Wars that all these other great powers had to do it. None of them did. And frankly, the Christian movement in this country was the driving force behind getting rid of the slave trade. But I'm so sorry, this is all we had time for. I could talk about this.
I know.
And I know we could talk about this for the whole rest of the programme.
Absolutely. We could. I mean, the church, can't they just talk about how brilliant Christianity is and how, you know, local parishes are doing a fantastic job with this and that? Anyway, don't go anywhere. Up next, we'll be discussing the Princess of Wales because her uncle is set to appear on a reality TV show. We'll let you know which one. You're watching Good Afternoon Britain on GB News.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Meanwhile, we've got Prince William getting on with being a real royal, or is he? I mean, this business about being ambassadorial in the Middle East, about the Gaza situation, about the Israeli situation, about trying to be friends with everyone, this is sensitive ground.
It's very demanding, I think. It must be one of the most difficult things he's ever done. He has been to Israel before and the Middle East. He was the first of the royals who went there, and he spoke to the leaders of both in Israel and on the West Bank. Yeah. And he managed it beautifully. He managed to carve a very sort of delicate path. I think as well, he doesn't want to cut ribbons. He doesn't want to do the ordinary things, to go round and see people and do it unless he really cares about it. This is people who are homeless. These are people who are in a war. I think he wants to go very, very high up, not for arrogance.
Make a difference in the world.
But to help, and to try and smooth things
Angela,
over.
I might be way off the mark here, but he did not, to me, look a happy man at BAFTAs on Sunday night. There was just
lonely, for sure.
Yeah, there was just something about his face that looked like I didn't want to be here.
It did. He did look lonely, but I also thought he made a huge effort so that everyone would enjoy it. He didn't want to pass it on. He doesn't use his personal feelings publicly, whereas Harry, you can tell a mile off what Harry's thinking. So he's done very well for that. And I think because he's been their president since 2010, he didn't want to let them down. Very nice of him. But he's obviously very worried about her. And he's got a lot of pressure there. I mean, he's a man with massive pressure for his father, for his wife, making sure the children are all right. And now he's taken on the Middle East, you know.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Right, it's 2:50. You're watching and listening to Good Afternoon Britain. Now, the Princess of Wales's uncle, a Gary Goldsmith, is set to make an appearance on the latest season of Celebrity Big Brother, which is starting tonight.
Goodness me, I didn't realise it was still going. But can we expect any royal secrets to be revealed? Or will Gary Goldsmith be on his best behaviour?
Well, presumably they want him on to try and reveal some secrets. We're joined by royal correspondent Cameron Walker. Cameron, I mean, I heard that his family had pretty much vetoed it last time around. He's been asked a few times. This time he's suddenly allowed in. Have his family just given up, or he's just disobeying their orders?
Well, The Sun was reporting this morning that Gary Goldsmith actually also auditioned for I'm a Celebrity, but ITV backtracked on that for fear that they would upset the palaces. So why now he's reportedly going into the Celebrity Big Brother house, the first season of Celebrity Big Brother since 2018, we're not entirely sure. Clearly, the papers are reporting that the Middleton family, as in Carol Middleton, the mother of the Princess of Wales, who is sister of Gary, is, let's say, not particularly impressed. The Sun saying they are infuriated by that news. I have tried to get some kind of answer out of Kensington Palace as to their thoughts. So far have received no response. But I think, to be honest, if Gary does talk about his niece, the Princess of Wales, I think it will be quite measured. I think he'll be very supportive and probably singing her praises, to be honest. He did an interview with GB News around a year ago where he really did praise the Princess of Wales's down-to-earth nature, saying she was very much a hugger, a family person, and all the rest of it, even when the cameras are turned off, and mentions Prince George as well, because, of course, Gary is not only the not only the uncle of the Princess of Wales, but he's also the great-uncle of future King Prince George. So clearly there is a bit of a connection here and a bit of a, perhaps, headache for the royal family to exactly what he says. What I predict, though, is that he's also going to be very critical about the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Harry and Meghan, when their Netflix documentary came out, when they, which was documenting their transition away as working members of the royal family. He was very, very vocal on social media, criticising the revealing of royal family secrets, and in his view, it was perhaps not very accurate in terms of what Harry and Meghan were saying. So I think Kate will get quite a good ride. Harry and Meghan, not so much.
He is just fitting that stereotype of the deeply embarrassing uncle, isn't he? I can imagine he thinks that he's doing the best for the family. He thinks he's going out there to bat for... But clearly, Cameron, this is the last thing the Princess of Wales needs.
Yeah, and I think what the Princess of Wales and indeed Prince William really care about is their privacy, and what they really don't want is yet another family member going on national television, spilling all the secrets, but especially since the Princess of Wales is still recovering from abdominal surgery. Kensington Palace says she's doing well, but clearly she has a right to keep her medical details private. I would be unbelievably surprised, in fact it would be almost gobsmacking if Gary Goldsmith revealed any medical details about the Princess of Wales. Even if he does say it when it's all being recorded, if ITV chose to air it, I think that would be a huge bombshell and would become a bit of a scandal. So I suspect that probably won't happen. But nonetheless, I think palace officials behind the scenes will be, at the very least, uncomfortable with the idea of that's the future Queen's uncle is going to be going on a national TV show where he could be potentially asked anything for the next 3 weeks, and he's going to have to answer.
Well, yes. I mean, if anything, it would be unkind, wouldn't it, to reveal anything about the Princess of Wales? It wouldn't be very, wouldn't be very nice to the family. But thank you very much indeed, Cameron Walker. That's all
and
from us.
I know Cameron will be watching it, so we don't have to.
Yes, he will be.
But that is all on Good Afternoon Britain today. But don't worry, much more to come in your news day. Martin Daubney's up next from 3 to 6. Martin, what's on your show?
Yeah, George Galloway is back looking like the cat that's got the cream. Not for the first time. Remember that horrific image from Big Brother. Don't forget, this time we're going to have him doing his first ever speech in Parliament. Plus, will there be an unholy alliance joining back with Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott? The return of the hard left. Plus, on the 200th anniversary of the RNLI, we've got shocking footage showing their craft being used as little more than a taxi service for illegal immigrants. Exclusive videos there. Plus, the government, 10 years too late, have said they're going to deport hate preachers. Do you believe a single word they say, or have you heard it all before? All that coming up, but first, it's time for your latest weather forecast.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Most of us having a dank, murky old night with rain spreading its way northwards, and then a few fog patches are likely to form. The rain starts off over Wales and southwest England, but through this evening spreading into Northern Ireland, eventually into southern Scotland, across the Midlands too, and outbreaks of rain across eastern England by the end of the night. As it clears, it will turn quite murky and misty, a few thick fog patches likely over the Midlands and eastern England by dawn. And as the skies clear over Wales and southwest England, some pockets of frost are possible as well. So a bit of a mishmash on Tuesday morning. It's a dull, murky, dank start over eastern England and eastern Scotland. A few mist and fog patches lingering through the morning. Should brighten up in many places, but some showers in the southeast. They could be on the heavy side. Some early rain for Northern Ireland, brighter here come the afternoon, but that rain will spread into western parts of Scotland. In the sunny spells, feeling a bit warmer than today, probably. The wind's a bit lighter as well. Temperatures getting up to 10, 11, maybe 12 Celsius. Wednesday also starts cold, in fact, a more widespread frost likely. Staying fairly cloudy in eastern England, a few showers here and there, but much of the west set to have a dry and a fine day on Wednesday with some decent spells of sunshine. Temperatures sticking in single figures where it stays rather drab, but with a bit of sunshine further west, 10 to 12 Celsius likely. That's all for now.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests, and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for headlines.